Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adele Halliday, and I serve as
Bonjour
the
à tous,
Anti-Racism and Equity
moi
Lead
je
Staff at the
suis
National
Adèle
Office of the United
Halliday
Church of Canada.
et
And
je suis
I think we're
responsable de
delighted
la lutte
that all
contre
of you
le
have joined us
racisme
for
et
this
l'équité
gathering.
dans l'Église unie du
This is the
Canada. Je suis
first
très
40
heureuse de
days
vous
live
savoir
event
aujourd'hui.
for this season,
C'est donc la
and it's good
première
that you are here.
journée pour lancer notre saison de
Tonight's
40
event
jours.
is a bilingual one, and so
Notre
we
événement
would
ce
invite you
soir
to
est un
enable
événement
interpretation
bilingue et
on your
donc vous allez
screen
pouvoir vous
because the presentation will
servir
be in both English and
de
French.
l'interprétation.
To
Il y aura
enable interpretation, if
interprétation
you
en
could please
anglais et
hover
en
over
français.
on your
Alors, pour
screen, it will
pouvoir
look like
vous
a
en
globe,
servir,
and then
je
you can
vous
choose the
invite
language that you would
à
prefer, either
chercher
English or
et
French.
choisir la langue de votre choix.
So for tonight, we will
Donc,
be
pour ce
soon
soir,
engaging in a conversation
nous
about the
allons
dual
avoir une
function of
conversation
genealogy and
sur
family
la,
lore in cases of
euh,
race shifting, and we will introduce
sur
our
la,
presenter in a moment. But first, just a few
l'ascendance quand les Blancs
background, a
revendiquent
few
leur
pieces of
entité
background.
autochtone. Et donc,
This gathering is part of the 40 days of
entité
engagement on
double. Donc,
anti-racism, and
nous
this
travaillons
series for
dans le cadre de la
2023 began
série des
today.
40 jours
Today, the
d'action
first written
dans la
reflections
lutte
are up
contre le
online,
racisme.
and this is
Nous
the
avons
first
des
of the 40
réflexions tous les
days live
jours dans
series
notre
that will be
site
running
web en
on
anglais.
Tuesdays
Et
at
tous
7
les
o'clock p.m.
mardis,
Eastern
il y
Time.
aura donc
This
des
gathering is
activités.
also recorded,
Cette
so
rencontre
the video will
aussi
also be available afterwards for sharing
est
in both English
enregistrée.
and
Donc,
French.
si vous le souhaitez, vous allez pouvoir vous
Today
procurer
is a
une
conversation
version
about
de cette
land and
enregistrée.
identity
Aujourd'hui, nous
and
allons
treaty.
parler des
And so in many
territoires,
ways, we'll be acknowledging the land
des
by engaging in this
traités et des
conversation
peuples.
today.
Et nous allons en
So thank
quelque
you once
sorte
again for being
parler de la
here.
terre, du territoire au
For the
fur et à
40
mesure
days,
que
in
l'on va.
addition to the live events, there are also a series of
Alors,
study groups
en
that will
plus
begin next week.
ces,
These study groups are also offered in English and
ces
French,
événements, il y
and
aura des
you
groupes
can sign up for
d'études
them as well on the Church X
en anglais
website.
et en français. On
Like the
vous
rest
invite
of
à
the
vous
40
y
days series, there's
inscrire.
no charge to attend,
Il
and
n'y a
they're
pas
offered on different days as
il n'y
well
a
as
rien
different
à
time
payer.
zones.
Et tout ça, c'est pour accommoder tout
I
le
would also
monde et
note
aussi
that
dans
there
toutes les
are books
zones
available.
horaires. Il y
This
a
week,
également
there are several
des livres que nous
featured books.
souhaitons
This week's featured book
recommander
is written
cette
by
semaine,
the
comme vous
author.
comprenez.
The author
C'est
of this book
écrit
is
par
the speaker
l'auteur
who will be sharing tonight,
qui
Dr.
est
Darryl Leroux. And his book, Distorted Identity, White Claims to
le livre
Distorted Descent, White Claims to Indigenous
Distorted
Identity.
Descent, White Claims
It
to
is available
Indigenous
from the United Church
Identity.
bookstore,
On peut le
and if you use
trouver
the
dans
code
la
40
librairie
days,
de l'Église
you
unie
can receive a discount of
du
20%
Canada
off
et
for
vous
orders
allez
of
pouvoir
2 or
avoir
more
une
books.
réduction de
This book
20%
is
si vous
also
mentionnez
available in
que vous êtes
French.
intéressé dans le cadre de ça. Ce
Finally,
livre-là a été
at the
traduit
very
d'ailleurs
end of
déjà
this
en
gathering,
français.
there is an exit
À la
survey.
fin
It
de
too is available in English and
cette
French. So at the
rencontre,
end of the
il y
session,
aura
when you click
un
leave,
sondage
there'll be
et
some
avant que
questions
vous
that
ne
pop up
quittiez,
that we'd
on va
invite
vous
you to
demander
fill
d'avoir
out
la
before
gentillesse de
exiting
remplir
completely.
ces sondages. C'est uniquement 4 questions.
So with that, I would like to
Alors,
introduce
avec
my colleague
ceci, j'aimerais
Springwater,
ça
who works in the Indigenous
présenter ma
Ministries and
collègue
Justice Unit at the National Office, and she
Springwater
will
qui
guide us
travaille
through the rest of
dans
the evening. She will be our
terre
moderator
de
and
justice
also guiding
sociale et
questions.
lutte
So
contre
over
le
to you,
racisme.
Springwater, and
Elle
thanks again.
va vous présenter notre
Good
conférencier
evening,
de ce soir.
everyone.
Bonsoir.
My name is Springwater Hester-Meawassige,
Je
and I am
m'appelle
the
Springwater
Youth Leadership Coordinator with
Hester-Meawassige
Indigenous
et
Ministries and Justice
je
at the United
travaille avec
Church of
les jeunes
Canada.
dans le ministère des jeunes.
My father originally comes from Waskaganish First Nation, which is northern James Bay, Quebec, and my mother is originally from Serpent River First Nation. I grew up in Northern Ontario and attended a predominantly white Catholic
J'ai
school.
grandi dans le nord
Back
de
then, no
l'Ontario
one
et
was
j'ai
looking to be
fréquenté une école
Indigenous or
catholique
Métis. We were often looked
majoritairement
down on
blanche.
and mocked
À
when we
l'époque,
made
personne
purchases
ne
using our
cherchait
status
à
cards at
être
the mall.
autochtone ou métis.
We were often
On nous
called
regardait
out for our
même
supposed free
de haut en
education
bas
and
et
all
on
the
se
other
moquait de nous
supposed
lorsque
perks
nous
that
fassions
came
des
with our
achats
treaty
au centre
rights.
commercial
A few
en
years
utilisant
ago,
nos
I read
cartes de
Darryl
statut.
Leroux's book,
On nous
and
reprochait
I was
souvent
completely in
notre
awe of the
prétendue
depth of the
gratuité
research.
et de
Darryl's book was
l'enseignement et
able
les
to lay
autres
out facts
avantages
for me that would
supposés
better
qui
equip me to
découlaient de
speak
nos
to
droits.
Indigenous
Il y a
identity
quelques
theft.
années, j'ai vu le livre de
In
Darryl
the last
Leroux,
10 years or
White
so,
Claims
I've been
to
seeing more
Indigenous
and more
Identity.
people claiming to be Indigenous.
Et
I have heard
j'étais
some
complètement
Indigenous people call
impressionnée
this
par la profondeur de ses recherches, le livre de Darryl m'a permis d'exposer des faits qui m'ont permis de mieux parler de l'usurpation de l'identité autochtone. Depuis une dizaine d'années, nous voyons de plus en plus des personnes se prétendre autochtones. J'ai entendu certains autochtones qualifier ces phénomènes d'une nouvelle vague colonialiste. En mes réponses ce soir, j'ai entendu une entrevue, celle de David Chartrand de la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba. Il a raconté comment les Métis ont hissé leur rapport en 1816 lors de leur victoire à Fort Plain et comment le Comité national des Métis a été consolidé en tant que gouvernement provincial en 1869 à Riel, à sa tête. M. Chartrand parlait du fait que les Métis avaient leur propre langue et qu'on les appelait le peuple de perles et de fleurs. Et toutes ces choses différentes dont Chartrand a parlé montrent un continuum de notre peuple. Aujourd'hui, nous assistons à une vague de Métis qui s'identifient comme tels et prétendent qu'ils sont Métis parce qu'ils se prétendent être sans mêlés. Et en regardant tout ça, nous constatons qu'il y a une augmentation de ces genres de cas. Alors, il y a beaucoup, nous avons constaté la flux près de la révision constitutionnelle. Et justement,
Dr. Darryl Leroux is the author of Distorted Descent, White Claims to Indigenous Identity. He has presented his work on false claims of Indigenous identity widely since then,
il va nous parler
including
de
to the
comment
chiefs
les
of
gens
Ontario,
essaient de
Nunavut,
utiliser
I'm not going to say this word properly, Tunngavik, and
autochtones.
the
Il y a
Manitoba
Tunngavik
Métis Federation, to
dans la
colleagues and
Fédération du
students in
Manitoba,
almost 40
des collègues.
universities,
Il a
and to
présenté
the
aussi
public
ça
at
parmi
large at
des
libraries,
étudiants
workplaces, and
et
organizations.
dans son
His most
droit,
recent work focuses on the creation and
des
circulation of
écoles,
family lore about
des lieux de
Indigenous
travail.
ancestry and identity in white Canadian
Alors,
families.
il a parlé toujours de
And we are super
l'identité
excited
et
to
les
have
histoires de
Darryl here
famille
with
dans
us
les
tonight.
familles
Thanks so much,
blanches.
Springwater.
Merci beaucoup,
Yeah, and I'm really
Springwater.
happy to be here as well.
Je
And
suis
I'd
très
like to
heureux d'être
thank
là.
Adele for
Merci
her work
Adèle
on the 40 Days of
pour
Anti-Racism and
votre
Springwater,
travail sur le
for
racisme
reading my
et de
book and
Springwater.
I think for what ended
Je
up
la
becoming the
remercie aussi
invitation to speak
d'avoir lu
tonight.
mon
So
livre
I've
et
worked
de m'avoir
closely
présenté
now
à
with both of them
vous.
for a while, and it's been a
Alors,
pleasure. And thank you
c'est
also
un
to the rest of the
plaisir
team
puisque
who
ces
are helping
livres-là
out
ont
on
été
tech and
écrits, enfin ce livre a été
interpretation.
écrit
It's really
déjà en
much
2019,
appreciated.
puis traduit en français.
I'll say
Donc
that in
c'est un
French,
plaisir de vous
just
le
so we could
présenter.
kind of stick with the
Je vais le
theme
dire en
of the presentation.
français
Donc,
de sorte
je voulais juste dire merci à Springwater et aussi à Adèle. Adèle maintenant me disait que c'est la 3e année qu'il y a les 40 jours d'antiracisme, donc c'est vraiment quelque chose à lui féliciter et je suis très content d'être ici avec vous. So I often get asked when I started doing this particular type of research.
On me demande souvent quand est-ce que je commençais à faire ce genre de recherche, et c'est très
My answer
spécifique.
is, I think, always the
Et
same, and it really comes back
je pense que
to
ma
a
réponse
course
est
that
toujours la
I
même.
took at Trent University. It was a course in Indigenous Studies.
J'étais à l'université de Trent
And
dans les
it was a course on
études
sort of
socio-ethniques.
Indigenous worldviews and
C'était,
methodologies,
on
ways of seeing
travaillait
the world.
sur
It was taught by
les affaires
First Nations woman
concernant
from
les
Yukon,
peuples
Alice Williams.
autochtones, des peuples
And I remember that
au
in that course,
Yukon.
there
Et
was a
je me
majority
souviens
white
que lors de
students. There
ce
were quite a
cours,
few Indigenous
il y
students,
avait
but the
des
majority of us were white
étudiants
students.
blancs et quelques
Most of
autochtones.
us wanted to do sort of the end of
Et
term
la
project
plupart de
on
nous,
something
on
related
voulait
to
faire
Indigenous peoples.
un
And
travail
she
de
really
fin
kind
de
of pushed
cours sur les
the
peuples
non-Indigenous students,
autochtones.
particularly the white students, to
Et le
research their own
professeur a
families
demandé
and
aux
really
étudiants de
understand
vraiment
who they are and who we are
de
in
rechercher
relation to the histories of our families on these lands.
à savoir
And I kind of took that to heart. I
qui
wouldn't
ils
say
étaient,
that
quelle
that
était leur
particular term paper
identité.
was fantastic, but
Alors,
since that
c'était une bonne
time, that
idée
has been
et à
my
partir de
goal,
là,
my objective in my
ça a
research has been
été,
really
ça
to
m'a ouvert
look
les
at
yeux
the
à
specific
ce champ
forms of racism and
et
colonialism
ça m'a
that
ouvert
are
les
proper
portes
to French
pour le
Canadians
fait d'étudier le
and to
racisme,
Quebecois people.
les
And so I've been doing
certaines
that for almost
attitudes
20
des
years
Canadiens
now.
blancs et des
And so
Québécois.
this
Et ça fait
project
quand
kind
même
of just
quelques années et
organically
alors ce
flowed out of
projet
that.
est
It's not
devenu
like I set out
grand,
one day to
a
just
grandi,
research this, but
s'est
it was
épanoui
in conversation with colleagues, as often
et
our work is.
Et le livre est
with
sorti
friends
justement de
that I
conversations
started
avec
to
des
realize that there were
collègues.
these new groups that were popping
Et
up.
je me suis aperçue qu'il y avait énormément de
You know, I
groupes
started to research them
qui
alongside some Métis colleagues from
leur
out west.
apparence
And that's
et
kind of
qui,
how, I guess, my interest in this
où il y avait des
phenomenon,
doutes sur l'identité des
whether we
gens. Il y a un
call it
phénomène.
self-indigenization, whether we
Alors,
call
c'est
it
un phénomène.
race
Est-ce qu'on peut
shifting, as I
l'appeler
did in my book,
l'auto-autochtonisation,
whatever we call it, this is a phenomenon that is
l'usurpation
somewhat
d'identité? Enfin, je ne sais
maybe
pas, mais c'est un
surprisingly
phénomène.
has really taken off in our society.
Et c'est un
My
phénomène
estimate,
qui est de
there's
plus en plus
anywhere
répandu.
from 200 to
Selon moi,
300,000
il y a
white
entre
Canadians,
2000
French
et 200
descendants,
000
people like me who are French
Canadiens
Canadians,
français
who are making
qui
claims to being Indigenous,
souhaitent
largely based
devenir ou
on
qui
ancestry from the
font la
1600s.
demande de
And so
devenir
before I
reconnus
continue, I'd
autochtones.
like to share
Alors,
this sort
avant
of
de
slide presentation that I
commencer,
have.
j'aimerais
So you'll
vous
notice that
présenter une
I've sort of
diapositive.
selected
J'ai
some images from the book in English and also the book in
trouvé
French.
des images,
So
enfin,
I'm going to
ici,
keep
des
the
images
sort of
de mon
image
livre
on the
en
French part
français
for those of
et
you
sa
who
version
are French
française
speaking and would
aussi.
like to see that.
Alors
My
voilà,
presentation
donc
will be
vous allez
almost
trouver qu'il
entirely
y a
in
des
English,
images en
but there
français
will be those
et en
French
anglais.
language sort of
Et quand même, je vais vous dire que la
images,
plupart de
particularly
ma
at the beginning.
présentation va se passer en français.
So let me just share my screen here.
Donc, permettez-moi de vous présenter l'écran.
All right.
Bon,
So I'm in my
voilà,
office at the University of
je
Ottawa.
suis à mon bureau de l'Université
I'm one of
d'Ottawa.
the few people in their offices at the moment.
Je suis un de peu qui
And so
reste
this
là
is
ce soir,
really my first
à
attempt
cette heure-ci. Donc,
at
voici
sort of
mon
combining two
premier
aspects of my research. So the sort of previous
essai
aspect of my research that is really the
de
basis
réunir deux
for
aspects de ma
distorted
recherche,
descent. And then the
c'est-à-dire la
new
double
part of my
fonction de la
research that
généalogie et
will
des
hopefully
histoires de
one day
famille
form
dans
part
l'auto-autochtonisation.
of a book to come, but it is
Et
really
je
about
pense
family
que
lore. And I'll get to why I've kind of
cette
moved to
recherche
family lore
me
in a
mène à une
moment.
autre
But
question et
distorted
je
descent is
viendrai sans
really
doute
about
à un moment
the
donné
use of
à
genealogy.
parler de
And so
des histoires de
writing this
famille
book, I
chez
sort of
les Blancs.
developed this
Alors,
this
j'ai
understanding
ici,
of this process
par
that's occurring
exemple,
here among French descendants. And just to be clear, when I say French
vous
descendants,
voyez,
I mean
dans le chapitre
individuals
1,
who
vous
are
voyez, il
descended
y a
from
le
the
colonne
first
blanc
French
utilise les
settlers
femmes
from the
autochtones, le
early
colonne blanc
1600s in New France. Just so I'm clear. I'm not saying
sur
francophones, I'm
l'identité
not saying
autochtone.
Québécois
Je ne
people,
vais
because
pas dire que
many French
tous les
descendants don't
Québécois ou que
necessarily
tous
speak French today. Some of them live in the United States and have for several generations. Some of them live in other
de
provinces.
Français
About half of the French descendants in
le
Canada
font.
speak French.
Il y a même des gens qui ont parlé
There's
français qui
about
ne le parlent plus.
13 to 14 million of us in Canada.
Il y a à peu
Il y
près
en a
half live in
14
Quebec
millions.
and half live outside of Quebec.
13 à 14 millions de nous au Canada
And
et
so
la moitié qui vivent
I
en
developed
dehors
this
du
idea of
Québec.
the mechanics of
Et
descent
donc,
to kind of
j'ai
explain how
développé cette idée de la mécanique de
is a
l'ascendance
practice.
pour
It's
expliquer
something
que la
that we do,
généalogie est une
and
pratique,
because we
c'est
do
quelque chose que
something
l'on
with
fait,
our ancestors.
parce qu'on fait
It's
quelque
not
chose
just about going
de
back
nos
in time
ancêtres. Il ne
and
s'agit pas que de
finding out the
remonter dans le
truth
temps
about
et
our
de trouver
ancestors.
la
It's
vérité
really
sur nos
about,
ancêtres. Il s'agit,
in many ways, as I'll demonstrate, kind of transforming the identities of our actual ancestors.
de
And so that's what I
transformer les
mean
identités
by
de nos ancêtres.
the mechanics of
Je veux
descent.
dire
And so in this book, I
la
develop,
mécanique de
as you
l'ascendance.
see here in the
Donc, dans
English
ce
version,
livre,
there's three sort of
on voit
mechanics
donc,
of descent:
la
lineal
version
descent, aspirational
anglais,
descent, and
on
lateral
voit donc
descent.
les
And in this
différents types
presentation today,
d'ascendance.
I'm going to
Et
talk about the
dans
first
cette
two. So you see here in
aujourd'hui,
French,
je
c'est
vais parler des
l'ascendance
deux
linéaire and l'ascendance
premières, l'ascendance
ambitieuse.
linéaire et
And
l'ascendance
so
ambitieuse.
lineal descent is the most,
L'ascendance
you know,
linéaire
the most common form of genealogical research. There's nothing
plus commune
particularly
de la recherche
novel
généalogique.
about naming it
Il n'y a
lineal
rien de très
descent.
nouveau.
For those of you who
À
may
cela.
have been asked in the past, perhaps when you were a child in primary
Peut-être
school,
que
maybe
vous
even
avez
later on,
demandé
to
quand vous
bring a
étiez
family
à
tree
l'école
to school, right?
primaire,
And so
que
you
vous
bring a
avez
family
voulu,
tree,
donc,
and
vous avez
lineal
demandé
descent
d'amener
is essentially
l'arbre
this
généalogique
idea
de
that
votre
you're
famille
following a straight line back into
l'école.
your past.
Et
And so that
ça
line
vous donne
could
une
follow your
impression de
mother's
suivre
side, your father's
une
side, you know, your
droite
mother's
vers le
mother's side,
passé.
your mother's
Ça peut
father's
tomber
side.
du
And so
côté de
that's what's meant
paternel
by
ou maternel.
a
C'est ce
particular
que
family line.
cela
And that's why it's called lineal descent. So you go back as far as you can. It's not a straight line, but in a line in that family, and you find out what you can about that family. And so that in and of itself is nothing sort of novel. But when I talk about the mechanics of lineal descent, I'm introducing this idea that it's not, again, just about finding out about your specific family line, but about transforming that line in many ways to meet the desire that you might have today, whatever desires that might be. And so one thing that I actually, let me back up just a moment because I didn't really set out what I'm studying. So the material of what I'm studying are 5 genealogical forms. And that's really the basis for the first part of the book when I'm looking at these mechanics of descent. 3 of the genealogical forms are in French, 2 of them are in English. And the reason I use genealogical forms as opposed to social media, right? Because there's a lot of Facebook groups, there's a lot of Facebook groups about genealogy, for instance, is because I wanted to go back in time prior to the existence of social media. And so by using online genealogy forums, I could go back. In one case, one of the forums was created in 2001. So much before we were really using social media. And so 3 of them are in French, 2 of them are in English, and they're all geared towards French descendants. They're all there to help French descendants in some way either discover things about their ancestors, and some of them are specific to indigeneity, indigenous peoples, and their indigenous ancestry, and some of them are more broad but had specific threads, if you will, conversations about those topics around indigeneity. And so the 5 genealogical forms are the basis for this first part of the study. And so that's where I started to really understand that there's something that's being done with ancestors. People talk about ancestors in particular ways, sometimes transform the ancestors' identities in particular ways. And so it's really, in many ways, what we find out, or I found out while doing this research, is that the identities of particular individuals in the past are less important than what people want their identity to be today. And that's probably not very surprising to hear, but that's one of the things that becomes very clear in this research. Right. And so one of the things about lineal descent, for instance, that I guess I'd like to talk about here is the way, in particular, just a handful of Indigenous women get used by individuals on these forums, and since this time when I'm working on these forums, I've come to discover that Indigenous women are used the same way across a range of organizations by thousands and thousands. And before I continue, I also want to point out that as part of this book, I did my own complete genealogy and discovered that I have 3 Indigenous women in my ancestry. All 3 are born before 1650, and that's a relatively common phenomenon. So for French descendants, the large majority of us, historical demographers say about 75% of us will have a small amount of Indigenous ancestry, largely because anywhere from 5 to 10 Indigenous women, it's actually 13, some of them don't have children, but 5 to 10 Indigenous women marry Frenchmen before 1660. And there's a very small group of people in New France at that time. So most French descendants are related to at least 1 or 2 of those women, just like I am. And that's not that uncommon. It's true of the Prime Minister of Canada. It's true of the Premier of Quebec. It's true of Céline Dion. It's true of Mario Lemieux. It's true of Maurice Richard. I can go on and on. It's true of most of us, so much so that about 10 million of us in Canada today have this specific ancestry. Now, of course, 10 million of us aren't saying we're Indigenous because of it, but several hundred thousand are. And that's really sort of the basis of this research. And so here's an example of someone, actually Robert, who lives in the United States. And for those who aren't aware, between 1850 and 1910, about 500,000 Quebecois people immigrated to New England. And so right now in New England, there's probably around 3 million French descendants. And so it's not common on these English language forums to see American citizens who are Franco-Americans, as we may call them, sort
Il y a des
of
Franco-Américains
trying to
dans ces forums
discover whether
qui
or not
essaient
they
de
have Indigenous
découvrir
ancestors. So Robert, a
s'ils
U.S.
ont
citizen,
des
shared his recent
ancêtres
discovery of Marie
autochtones.
Sylvestre.
Robert a
Among his long
partagé
ago
cette
ancestors,
découverte.
Marie Sylvestre is a Huron-Wendat Algonquin woman who was
Il
born
parlait
in
de
1624.
Marie-Olivier
And so in his
Hubert
September
Sylvestre
2011 post, he
Manitobaïque.
says,
Et il dit donc
I
en
also am able
septembre
to trace my
2011,
ancestors
j'ai
back to these two
pu
people as the
retracer
parents
mes
of
ancêtres
Marie-Olivier Sylvestre,
jusqu'à
who married Martin
Marie-Oliver
Prévost in
Sylvestre
1644.
Manitobaïque,
I always
qui s'est
felt there
marié
was
avec
missing
Martin Prévost
something
en
and had a feeling there was
1644.
native in my
J'avais
background.
l'impression qu'il y avait
So,
de
can I claim
l'autochtone
status for me
dans
and
mon
my children,
ascendance. Est-ce
and
que je
who
peux
and where
donc
do we go?
revendiquer
This is just
le
an
statut
example of
d'Indien?
one of the posts that we
Alors,
see
et si
online
oui,
in
comment
these
est-ce que je le fais?
forums. They're not
C'est un exemple d'un
they're not
affichage
in any way
que l'on
uncommon.
voit dans ces forums.
These
C'est
were new to
assez
me in a way. I
commun.
started discovering about these
J'ai commencé à
particular ancestors and
découvrir
how they circulate and are
ces
used
ancêtres et comment ils sont
through my study
utilisés
of these
et comment
specific
ils
forums. And
circulent
so,
dans ces différents
in the
forums.
sort of back and forth, this
Dans
was
le
quite a
cadre de
long
mes études, et
thread.
donc
There were at least 30, I think it was
il y a
35
eu donc
different
des
responses.
discussions
And
avec
Robert is
environ 35
encouraged to
réponses
apply
et
for membership in a number of different
Robert, on l'encourage
organizations, to
à
say that he's
demander
Indigenous or in the American context Native
s'abonner à
American.
plusieurs organisations,
And some of these
revendiquer le
organizations
statut
produce
d'autochtone
cards that
dans le contexte
resemble
des
a
États-Unis. Ces
legitimate,
organisations
whether
produisent
in
des
Canada it's a
cartes
status
qui
card or in the United States a
ressemblent
tribal citizenship
à
card.
des cartes
And
de
so there's a
statut
lot of back and
légitime
forth and advice and stuff like that
les deux
sort of
pays. Donc,
circulates
il y a
on
beaucoup
these
de
forums
trucs
about
comme
how
ça
one
qui
can
circulent dans
transform
les forums de
themselves.
ce
As you
type.
can see here,
Alors
Robert
donc,
made a relatively recent discovery,
pour
but wants to transform
Robert
his entire
a
identity. He
découvert,
wants to
a
move
fait
away
cette
from
découverte
being
assez
a white
récemment, mais il veut
Franco-Ontarian
transformer son
American
identité. Il veut
to
ne
being
plus être
an Indigenous
un
person,
blanc, un
however
Américain
that may
blanc,
be
il veut
defined.
devenir un autochtone
And so this is just one
d'une manière ou
example of
d'une
how
autre. Et c'est donc un
Marie-Olivier
exemple
Sylvestre
de
gets
comment
used.
Marie-Olivier
And there
Sylvestre
are
est
some others that
utilisée.
I want to share here.
Il y en a d'autres que je veux vous
For
présenter.
instance, this is a
Par
table that
exemple,
I produced. What
voilà
I
un
did is I
tableau que
counted
j'ai produit, j'ai
the
compté
number of descendants
le
that the
nombre
three
de
women who I
descendants
kept seeing over and over and
de
over
ces
again in
trois
these
femmes que je
forums.
voyais
Remember that
continuellement dans ces
if you're a
forums.
French descendant, you're going to be related to a
Souvenez-vous
small
que si
group of
vous êtes
people.
d'ascendance française,
You know,
vous
we're
aurez
talking
donc
about a few hundred people
il y
at
aura
the
quelques
beginning
centaines de
of New
personnes qui
France.
seront au début de
And
la
so,
colonie
or that there
et
were a
qui
few
sont
hundred, and you're
les
going to be related
progeniteurs
to
de
maybe
tout le
100
monde.
or 300 or
Donc,
120 or whatever the case may be. And a
qui
few
se
of
trouvent dans
those
la
are likely
province
to be
maintenant.
Indigenous women, and
Donc,
these three women are the ones who are the most
quelques-unes
common.
de ces
And I
personnes
didn't
sont
know
des
this prior
femmes
to writing my
autochtones
book.
et on trouve le plus fréquemment ces trois femmes.
But it came out over and over in the forum because so many
Mais
people
on l'a
today
revu à
are
tellement de reprises dans le
descendants
forum
of
parce que
these
tellement de
specific
gens
women.
sont des
And so
descendants
the
de ces
first woman
femmes.
here is known only as the
La
Nipissing
première femme
woman in the
s'appelle
records.
seulement
So
femme
she
Nipissing.
shows
On ne
up
connaît pas
in
son
the
nom.
Jesuit
Elle
relations that were written
présente
by the
dans les relations
Jesuits
jésuites
when they arrived in New France.
Le,
And so
c'est
she
donc
had a
documents qui ont été
child with
produits par les
Jean Nicolet.
jésuites qui sont
Some of
arrivés en
you may
Nouvelle-France. Elle a
recognize
eu
the
un
name
enfant, Jean
Nicolet. There's a
Nicolet.
town in Quebec
Peut-être que vous connaissez ce
called Nicolet. There
nom-là,
are
parce qu'il
many
y a un
monuments and
village ou
streets named after Nicolet.
un
He was
bourg
one of
du Québec qui
Champlain's
s'appelle
lieutenants,
Nicolet.
and
Il
he was
était
sent
l'un des
to
lieutenants de
sort
Champlain,
of
de Samuel de Champlain. Il a été
he was sent
envoyé
west to Nipissing
vers l'ouest,
Territory,
vers le
today's
territoire
essentially
Nipissing,
North Bay, and he
donc
stayed there
vers
for 7 or 8 years. He
la ville de
returned
North Bay,
to
qui est
Quebec
devenue,
City with a
la ville
child.
de North
He
Bay.
had
Il est
a
revenu
woman
à
there.
Québec enfant.
And so when we talk about Nipissing woman, she was
Et quand
born
on
sometime
parle de cette
before
femme Nipissing, elle est née
1610, likely around
un peu avant,
1605,
en
and had a child
1610,
with Jean
probablement en
Nicolet. We don't know what happened to her.
1605.
All we know is
Alors, on
that
ne sait pas
Nicolet brought
qu'elle est
their
devenue,
daughter
mais ils
away
ont
from
un enfant.
her family
Et Nicolet,
to
lui,
Quebec City, where
il
she was then
a
raised by a
amené
Parisian
sa
family and then later
fille
by
à
the
Québec, où elle était
Sulpician
élevée par une
nuns who
famille
ran sort of
parisienne
a
et ensuite par une autre famille.
educational facility, if we can
Donc,
call it that, what we
en
might
fait,
call
non,
a residential
ensuite
school today,
par une école,
for
ce qu'on
Indigenous
appellerait aujourd'hui
children,
une école résidentielle,
particularly girls.
un pensionnat
And so
indien
so you can
pour
see
filles.
here what I did is I
Et
counted
donc,
the number of descendants
vous
that each
voyez
one
le
of
nombre
these
de
women who come
descendants
up
que j'ai
over and over again
compté
in the records
dans
had
chacune
by
des
the fifth
générations.
generation. You
Et
can
à la
see that
cinquième
this
génération,
Nipissing
on voit
woman had
qu'il y a
123 descendants, according to
que
my
la femme de
figures.
Nipissing avait
Marie
donc
Sylvestre
123
was
descendants
born
à
in
la cinquième génération.
1624. Was
Marie
actually
Sylvestre, qui est née vers
raised in
1624, a
the
été
same
élevée
household and in the
dans la
same
même
religious institution as the
et la
Nipissing
même
daughter.
institution
And so they
religieuse
were
que la
contemporaries and knew
fille
each
de
other.
la femme
And you can
Nipissing.
see here
Donc,
that
les
by the
deux se
fifth
connaissaient.
generation, whoops, sorry about
Et on
that,
voit que
she
donc,
has 10
rendu à la
times more
5e
descendants
génération,
than
elle a
the
10
Nipissing
fois
woman.
plus de
Which
descendants.
means, if we were going to, and I'll get to this in a moment,
Et
think
donc,
about
je
how
vais
many descendants they have today,
vous le
it
présenter
would
dans quelques
follow
instants, mais
that
si on
Marie
pense au
Sylvestre
nombre
would
de
have many
descendants
more descendants than
qu'ils ont, on
Nipissing.
sait que c'est Marie
And then the
Sylvestre qui
last
va
one
en
is
avoir beaucoup
Marie
plus que la femme
Mitawe
Nipissing.
Megukwe,
Et
an
ensuite, il y
Algonquin
a
woman
Marie
who was born in Trois-Rivières.
Meteau-Megoukwe,
And you can see that by the
une
fifth
femme
generation,
algonquine,
she also
née
has
vers
quite a few descendants,
1631, et on voit qu'à la
many more
cinquième
than
génération,
Nipissing.
elle en a
I'm quote
beaucoup de
unquote
descendants.
related to the
Moi,
first woman in this list and the third one.
j'ai de la parenté avec la
All right, so I
première et
wanted
la
to get to the
troisième
next slide
femme
here.
de cette liste.
And so
Pour
this
ainsi
is sort
dire.
of a correction, if you will,
Et
or
donc, ça,
corrective
c'est une
of my
correction
research. I'll explain
de ma
what's
recherche.
going on here.
Je vais vous
So there's a
expliquer ce qui se
really
passe.
large-scale
Donc,
program. It
il y
is
a
the social science
programme
research
de
program in
recherche
Canada
en
that has
démocratie
received the
historique,
most funding
et c'est le programme
social
des
science
sciences
research
sociales
history,
au Canada qui a
tens of
reçu
millions
le
of
plus de
dollars. It's
financement,
ran
des
out of the
dizaines de milliers
University
de
of
dollars,
Montreal. It's called the Programme de recherche en démographie
hébergé à
historique.
l'Université
And so
de
what they've
Montréal.
done
Et ce
is
qu'ils ont
they've
fait, c'est
digitized all of the
qu'ils ont
existing records
numérisé tous les
from
dossiers
New
existants
France up
de
until
la
actually and
Nouvelle-France
Quebec, and
et
anything
du
that
Québec
touches French
et tout
descendants
ce qui
until
touche aux
1849. And so the
descendants
first
français
documents that
jusqu'en
they digitized from
1849. Et
1621,
donc, les premiers
and they've
documents
digitized them
datent
all the
de
way to 1849. They have
1628 et
almost 2 million
ça va jusqu'à
separate digitized
1849. Ils
documents
ont presque
that are
2
vital
millions
records.
de
And so they're
documents
mostly church documents. Some of them are civil records. And this by
numérisés, surtout
vital
des documents
records, I mean
d'église.
birth,
Il y a aussi des documents
baptism,
civils, des
marriage,
certificats
and
de
death
naissance, de
records.
baptême, de mariage
And
et
so,
de
according to
décès.
their figures,
Et
I
donc,
contacted them
selon
after
leurs
publishing the book
chiffres,
and
je les
asked
ai
them if they could
contactés
run a
après avoir
program
publié
to
le
see how
livre.
many
Je leur ai
descendants
demandé s'ils
each one of
pouvaient
these four women. I added a fourth woman here. You can see
calculer le nombre de
Marguerite Pigarowish,
descendants
who's the
de
daughter of
ces
a well-known
femmes
Algonquin man.
en
And
consultant
you
ces
can,
documents.
I'm
Et donc, on
also
voit
quote unquote related to her. So these are the three
Pigarowish,
women that
les
I'm
trois
related.
femmes
Sorry, these three, the
avec
first three, the
lesquelles
three that
j'ai
I'm
soi-disant de
quote
la
unquote
parenté,
related to.
bien que
So by the
lointaine.
8th generation, which corresponds with about the
Et
middle
donc,
of the
rendu à la 8e
1800s,
génération,
that's
qui
why the
serait
figures
autour
stop there.
du
Remember that
début
they've
du
only
19e siècle.
digitized
Et c'est là
until
où les
then.
chiffres se
You can
terminent.
see that
Ils ont arrêté de
the
numériser
Nipissing
après
woman's
cette
daughter,
période-là.
or
Et
Nipissing
on
woman,
voit donc que la
has
fille de
had
la femme
60,000
Nipissing
descendants.
a rendu
Marie
là
Mité had over
60 000
68,000. Marguerite Pigarowish had
descendants. Marie,
185,000, and Marie Sylvestre had
68
194,000.
000.
Now, if we were to
Pigarowish,
take those figures from the middle of the 1800s into
184
today,
000 et
what ends up
Sylvestre,
happening is
194 000. Donc,
Marie
si
Sylvestre
on
has about
continue
2 million
la lignée,
living
on découvre que
descendants today.
Marie Sylvestre a environ 2
So if you're
millions de
asking why is he
descendants
going on
vivants.
about all of
Vous
these
vous
sort
demandez
of the
pourquoi est-ce
number of
qu'il
descendants that these people have,
s'éternise
it's to
sur le
demonstrate
nombre
that
de
these four women
descendants.
combined
C'est pour
likely
démontrer
have
que
between
ces
4 and
quatre
5
femmes
million
ensemble
living descendants today.
représentent de 4
Okay,
à
and
5
so
millions de
having one of these
descendants
women in your
vivants
ancestry in
aujourd'hui.
no
Donc,
way makes someone,
ce
if
n'est pas
that's
parce
the
que vous
basis of
avez
your
une
claim,
femme
in no way makes
parmi
someone
ces quatre
indigenous,
qui est un
but
ancêtre
it
à vous,
certainly
que
has
vous êtes autochtone.
sort of pushed
C'est bien
many
évident.
people in our
Mais
society
ça a
to
incité beaucoup de
make it
gens
seem
à
like
se
it
questionner à
does.
ce sujet.
Okay, so I'm going to go to
Donc
another
maintenant,
way to think
je
about
vais passer à
this
une autre
data.
manière de réfléchir
And
à
so
ces
these are
données. Et donc,
four
ce sont
organizations
quatre
whose sort of membership
organisations
lists
dont les listes de
were
membres
available publicly and that I
sont
analyzed as part of writing
disponibles
this book.
publiquement et je les ai
And you
analysées
can see
dans le
here that
cadre,
I've
dans le
listed
contexte de
those
ce
four women
livre.
again, and
J'ai
I've
encore indiqué
verified
ces
how
quatre
they're
femmes
used by
et j'ai
each of
vérifié
whether they're used, I
l'utilisation de
should say,
ces
by each of
femmes
these organizations.
par
And so you can see here that
leurs
there's an
organisations. Donc, on
Abenaki
voit qu'il
group
y a
in New Hampshire.
un
And
groupe
so the sample size was 918 members. They use Marie Sylvestre, who was not Abenaki. Remember that she was Algonquin and Huron-Wendat. Marie Mité, who is also Algonquin. She's also used. So she's the second most common root ancestor who's used by this group. She's the third most common. When it comes to a Métis organization, and I say this in quotation marks, in Maniwaki, so about an hour and a half north of Ottawa in Quebec, Marie Sylvestre is used the most often. And of course, this isn't super surprising because she would be most likely the Indigenous woman who factors into the genealogy of French descendants the most often today. And you can see how these four women are used by this Métis organization, often quite a bit. In the Algonquins of Ontario, you can see here again all four being used. And then finally, this Métis organization on the North Shore of Quebec, in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region.
France. Vous savez ici la communauté métisse du domaine du roi et de la seigneurie de Minga. Il y a deux femmes qui n'ont pas. Pourquoi est-ce que je parle de ceci? Parce que souvent, on a des personnes qui veulent honorer leurs ancêtres, mais en fait, ils sont en train de les déshonorer parce qu'ils se disent être abénaqués, puis ils utilisent des noms des femmes qui ne sont pas abénaquées. Et alors, qu'est-ce qu'ils veulent faire avec ceci? Ils veulent transformer leur identité et puis ils vont aller chercher des données où il ne faut pas, c'est-à-dire il y a toute une mécanique, il y a quelque chose qui arrive qu'on fait lorsqu'on a un désir véhément de devenir autochtone, alors que ce soit abénaqué, Maniwaki, ou que l'on veut être algonquin Ontario ou autre dans d'autres régions. Alors,
and so one other thing I just wanted to point out here, this is the
une
third
autre chose que j'ai souhaité souligner, c'est par ce tableau numéro 3, c'est la, je vais aller à l'anglais, c'est la généalogie approximative.
So you can see here, and this is according to
cette reconstruction approximative de la généalogie, je l'ai développée lorsque je faisais des recherches. Alors ici, vous pouvez voir quelle est la moyenne des Français qui ont des ancêtres autochtones. C'est des Français. Il y a moins d'1% d'anglais,
primarily Belgian.
Quelques
There's one
Européens,
Portuguese
des
man who
Belges,
becomes sort of a postal worker, I guess you could say, the mailman in Quebec City. And so many people have him in
des
their
gens comme les
genealogy.
facteurs
And then there's a couple sort of Swiss
qui
German
apparaissent là.
women as
Mais
well.
ensuite,
And then you also see here Indigenous sort of ancestry. So mine is quite comparable to the average sort of French descendant genealogy. You can see mine is a little bit less French, a little bit more English, a little bit more other European, and about the same Indigenous. In terms of the overall ancestry going back to the early 1600s. One thing that I find helps to illustrate the way in which this move to claim an Indigenous identity by French descendants is really quite political. Is if you look here, the average amount of English ancestry versus for French descendants versus the average amount of Indigenous ancestry is more than double. You don't see French descendants making a claim that they're English, right?
Très, très petit. On ne voit pas des francophones qui revendiquent le statut d'anglophone. On ne voit pas ça. Pourquoi est-ce qu'il y aurait des Blancs qui souhaiteraient revendiquer le statut autochtone? Il y a quelque chose qui n'est pas approprié. Ça n'a fait pas de sens. Et c'est pourquoi je me suis penchée sur la question.
And so I just wanted to briefly touch upon the second mechanic of descent. And this is what I call aspirational descent. And I think this one really helps to illustrate the sort of fantastical nature, if you will, of these claims, even more than the first one. And so this is, this is a profile of a particular family, I guess you can say, an ancestral family. That appears on a fairly well-known forum.
Qui est très connu dans les forums
so I'm just going to go through it rather quickly. I just want to see if I don't have it in French.
No. Je vais aller assez rapidement là-dessus.
Okay. And so this is what it's telling us. This woman here, and I want to point out that this is not a truthful information, but it's the type of information that counts as truth on these forums and then gets used by people to claim an Indigenous identity.
Il y a quelque chose, ça illustre le motif pourquoi les gens cherchent. Alors, parce qu'il y a énormément de personnes qui cherchent à avoir le statut autochtone. Alors, par exemple, nous avons l'exemple de Marguerite M. Micmac, qui était française et qui est prétendue autochtone parce qu'on l'a utilisée pour des revendications.
Catherine and Edmé Lejeune, who are Acadian.
Donc, les deux sœurs, Catherine et Edmé Lejeune, étaient des sœurs nées en Nouvelle-Écosse dans les années en 1600. Et voici un peu leur histoire.
Okay. And so it's said that a woman named Marguerite Mi'kmaq was born in 1585, and that her parents are Henry Membertou and Mary Abenaki. Henry Membertou is an actual historical figure. There's a Mi'kmaq community on Cape Breton that's called Membertou, and that's sort of because that this figure was the grand chief of the Mi'kmaq who met the French early on in the late 1500s. And so one of the things that happens with aspirational descent is that actual historical figures, Indigenous figures, mostly men, are part of the story to give it sort of the allure of truth.
Pourquoi je vous le dis, c'est parce que la plupart des personnes, c'est des hommes et utilisent des personnages. Alors, il y avait cette femme-là qui était mariée à un homme français qui était né en 1595. Et ces deux-là, Pierre le Jeune, Briand, ont eu les deux filles, Catherine et Edmé le Jeune. Donc, alors, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Les parents ont donné les enfants à des Français. Elle est transportée en France. Elle a deux enfants. Elle revient ensuite avec deux enfants qui sont nés en France. Alors, il y a un problème ici que j'ai technique, je pense, avec cette
One of the
image.
problems is that if you look at when Mary Abenaki, Margaret's mother, is born, she's born in 1582, and Margaret is born in 1585. So it's obviously quite unlikely that Mary had a child when she was 3 years old, unless something really spectacular was happening in the 1500s that we're just not aware of. I quite doubt that. There are other things that don't quite work out in terms of the timeline. She has a child in 1625, but she dies in 1611. Again, quite difficult to have children with
un enfant en 1625, mais en fait, on
and
sait
so
qu'elle
there are ways in which
elle
this
meurt
story,
en
though, regardless
1611.
of its
Et
truth,
alors, il
circulates
y a des
online so much
histoires
so
comme
that
ça qui
Catherine and Edmé
courent,
Lejeune
et
are
tout à
actually
coup, elles ne
accepted
sont
as
pas
Indigenous women,
logiques.
Indigenous root ancestors by a range of organizations. And so I just
Alors,
want to give you a couple
je vais
examples.
vous
This,
donner
you can see
ici
here that I've
quelques
redacted the
exemples
person's name.
qui
It's
sont
an individual who was
utilisés
born in
par
1986.
plusieurs
And this is the Maniwaki
des
Métis
organisations.
organization.
Nous
Again, that's
savons
about an hour and a half north of Ottawa. They have
par
several thousand members. At last count, they were sharing they had
l'organisation qui
6,000
a
members.
quelque chose à une heure
And
de
so
Ottawa.
this is
Et
one of their
donc,
membership records for one of the
ça
individuals, which
c'est
they presented in a court case in 2016. So
un
now
tableau
they're publicly available.
où ils
And so you can see that this
membres.
individual is claiming a
vous voyez
13th
ici,
generation ancestor.
il y
Catherine
a
Lejeune, remember we just saw Catherine
une
Lejeune,
personne, vous voyez
and
le
you can
numéro
see
13,
that she is
il
identified
utilise le
as
nom des
Métis
jeunes
Mi'kmaq, so mixed race Mi'kmaq woman,
comme
gets married
quelqu'un
in
de ses
1650.
ancêtres.
That's
Et
obviously
alors,
not true. If you remember, she's an
il dit
Acadian woman, a girl who's
elle
born
existe
in
en
the 1640s.
1650, alors qu'on sait qu'elle
But
est
the
décédée en
story
1611.
circulating that
Mais
she's the
l'histoire
grandchild of Membertou, the
dit
grand chief
qu'elle
of the
est
Mi'kmaq, has really taken root to the point where all of these
qu'elle est
different
quelqu'un d'important dans sa
organizations
famille. Et
who
pourquoi?
exist
Parce qu'en fait, cette
in
femme-là
Quebec,
était un grand chef
in Nova
d'un
Scotia,
groupe
in New
à un moment
Brunswick, in
donné.
Ontario, and also in New
Et
England,
alors,
in
on
Vermont,
a
and New
énormément de
Hampshire,
gens en
except
Ontario,
Catherine Lejeune, who
Nouvelle-Écosse,
is one of
Québec,
my ancestors
et
as
qui
well,
utilisent même
and also
en
one of
Ontario,
Justin Trudeau's
utilisent
ancestors as an Indigenous woman. And we see here another file.
cette
This
femme-là
person's born in
comme ancêtre même
1969.
dans la lignée de
Basically
Trudeau.
the same
Imaginez.
story,
Et c'est
except
toujours
instead
la
of
même
Catherine
histoire.
Lejeune, it's her sister Edmé, not related to her.
On me parle
But you
de
can see
Catherine
she's a
Lejeune, sa
13th gen. This
sœur,
person is a 13th generation descendant of Edmé
et cette
Lejeune. And
personne-là
that in
est
and of itself is enough to give this person a membership in this so-called Indigenous
ils utilisent ces personnes-là et ils vont à une organisation. Ils leur permettent de s'inscrire, d'adhérer comme membres, alors que leur histoire ne tient pas debout. Alors, c'est pourquoi que la deuxième partie de ma recherche va étudier justement tous les demandes de
which specific,
identité
it's
autochtone,
almost always women are being
statut.
used, how they're being
Alors,
used,
qu'est-ce qu'on va
and
qu'on
really how
utilise
they're
des
being
femmes
misused.
la plupart du temps.
And so you
Et
can
en
see
fait,
here in
comme
this
pas, on les
case,
utilise à bon
when we
escient,
can't
mais à
find an
mauvais
Indigenous
escient.
ancestor, because these two
Et qu'est-ce qui se
individuals,
passe
what happens with
quand
these
on ne
membership
trouve
files
pas
is if there are other Indigenous ancestors
des
in a
ancêtres
person's background, it'll
autochtones
be
dans la
part of the
famille?
file, so
On
there'll
va
be
aller
others who are listed. But these two
chercher un
individuals don't
ancêtre
have any other
qui fait partie de
quote-unquote
l'histoire.
Indigenous
Alors,
ancestors.
et qu'est-ce
They
qui se
become
passe
members
dans les
solely on the basis
associations
of the Lejeune, one of the
qui
Lejeune sisters. So if you don't
acceptent
have an
ces
Indigenous
membres?
ancestor, you make one.
Ils classent
And that's what I
les
mean here
dossiers
by
et puis voilà.
aspirational descent.
Ils peuvent devenir
Now you
membres,
might
ils
be
sont
saying, well, that's
adhérés
really
et
nice,
puis
but what
ils
does
vont
that mean?
continuer
There are
à
members
faire
of these
leur
organizations who show their
démarche.
cards, who have
Alors, qu'est-ce
taken
qui
up
se passe par la
positions
suite?
at
La
universities,
plupart de ces
as
personnes-là qui ont
professors,
obtenu une
at different
carte
organizations,
d'une
particularly the federal
organisation
government,
vont devenir des
positions that are
professeurs,
reserved for
vont
Indigenous
aller
peoples. They get
chercher
scholarships and
des
bursaries at
postes
universities
qui
as well,
sont
because our institutions
normalement
generally operate
destinés
on the logic of
aux
self-identification. So all
aux
you need to do
membres
is
de la
say, hey,
communauté
I'm Indigenous over
autochtone.
here.
Ils vont
There are
aller
reasons
chercher
why
toutes
our
sortes de
institutions
faveurs.
adopted that
Et
policy
c'est
essentially back in
pourquoi
the 1990s, or we could discuss that if
il
you
y a
like.
eu à un moment donné
But my research, I think, demonstrates that
de ce fait
self-identification
un arrêt
has seen its day, if you
qui
will.
a dû être
All right.
fait par la Cour.
So before I move to this question of family lore, I
Pour
just wanted to
justement
check in
dire,
with
bon, qui c'est
Springwater to
qui
see.
est
I'm not actually going
autochtone
through
et
any
quels
of the
sont
chat or
les,
anything like that. I find it a bit distracting when I'm kind of presenting material. So I
les
just wanted to
critères.
go to
Alors, moi,
Springwater to see
j'aimerais
if
vous
there are any
montrer,
questions or
parler de
comments that we can
Springwater.
take
Je vais
before we skip
demander,
to
avant
the family lore
d'aborder
component.
cette
Sure, we do
diapositive
have a
sur
couple
les sociologistes
questions.
anglais.
I'm just wondering, how long do you think we have for questions, Darryl?
J'aimerais ça
I don't know,
savoir
we could
de
take 10
combien
or
de
15
temps
minutes.
on va
if that
voir.
Okay.
works.
On
All right,
va
so
prendre
Nicole is
10 ou 15
wondering, what are
minutes.
your thoughts around the DNA
Alors,
testing?
on veut savoir qu'est-ce que
Yeah,
vous
that's a good
pensez
question.
des
So
tests
actually,
de
in my book, I do
DNA.
discuss DNA ancestry testing on a
Effectivement,
couple
je
occasions.
discute de ça dans mon
I am
livre.
generally quite unfavorable to DNA
En
ancestry
général, je
testing.
ne
Now,
suis
I
pas
just
très
want to
en
be clear,
faveur
though,
de
that
ces
I'm not
tests.
saying
Et
that
je vais vous
I
dire pourquoi.
wholeheartedly disagree with DNA testing.
Ça ne veut pas
There
dire
are
que je ne
different
suis
types
pas
of
du
DNA
tout
testing,
d'accord.
right? You
Tout
can
simplement, il y a
have
des
a
façons de
particular
faire.
type of DNA testing that's about
Par exemple,
identifying
vous pouvez
family
avoir
members, right? And so it could
un
be
type
one of your
d'ADN,
parents, it could be
un test
cousins,
d'ADN
that sort of thing.
pour identifier vos
Sometimes that's called
cousins,
DNA
vos
ancestry
familles
testing.
proches.
What I'm talking
Mais
about in
lorsque
relation to that
c'est
is
pour
when the
identifier
type of
vos
ancestry
aïeuls,
testing where you're trying to
le
assess one's
genre de
identity,
test,
not whether you're connected to an
et il
individual,
est fait
right?
pour
So if you're connected to a
évaluer
second cousin, or
l'identité,
you have a paternity test and you want to know if someone's connected to you as
de la
their
personne.
child. So this is
Alors,
something
vous
different.
voulez savoir
DNA ancestry
s'il y a
testing, I think the
quelqu'un
most
dans vos
important work on
ancêtres
that
qui a été
topic is really done by Dr. Kim Tallbear.
autochtone.
And Kim
Alors, c'est la
Tallbear
façon
is
dont c'est
a
fait.
professor at the University of Alberta. She's a Dakota woman. And she wrote a book called Native American
Alors,
DNA
cette
that
femme-là
really
a écrit un
explains the
livre
sort of
aussi,
risks
la
that
sociologiste
come with
Carol Smart,
defining indigeneity
qui,
and indigenous identity,
qui a
really
beaucoup
identities according
écrit
to a
pour
strict
démontrer les histoires des
understanding
gens
of
qui se racontent
biology,
sur
right?
leur
And so
famille et peuvent
that's
être considérés comme de simples
that's
récits
what my
factuels,
work
car elles
is
sont
meant
liées
to
à la
also
relation
challenge
complexe
in a way,
entre le
right?
pouvoir
That
social personnel et culturel et
in
social.
my view, what's happening in what I've just
Alors,
described is that people are returning to the past, are discovering something that they believe to be true, and in some
Donc, je
cases
crois
it
que
is in
les
terms of their
gens
ancestry.
reviennent au
And they're
passé
using
et
that
découvrent des choses
biological
qu'ils
relationship,
croient
however
être vraies, et
tenuous
ils
it is,
utilisent
to
cette
make a
relation
claim
biologique,
about a
ce lien
social and
biologique,
political identity.
pour
And that's something that Kim Tallbear has
revendiquer
really
une
explained
identité
quite well.
politique et
And so,
sociale.
you know,
Et c'est quelque chose que Kim
my
Tallbear
work
a
is
expliqué très
about
bien.
white people
Moi, mon
it's not
travail
so much
porte
about
sur les
Indigenous
Blancs,
people, but because there's a
essentiellement sur
boundary there
les
that's being
autochtones. Mais
sort of
comme
in
il
a
y a
way pushed and challenged,
une
obviously
frontière qui est
there's a discussion that
contestée
occurs
entre les
around both
deux,
of those
il y a
identities.
une
And one
discussion
thing that's
qui tourne
happening that's
autour de ces deux
clear
identités.
since the 1970s and 80s is that white people are trying to
Et quelque
disinvest
chose qui est
themselves from
clair
whiteness.
depuis les années
They're trying to
70
become
et
anything but
80 et
white.
que les Blancs essaient de
And so there's a lot of research in the United States by sociologists,
d'enlever
anthropologists, and others
le
who
blanc
explain that process that
donc
really occurs
et il y
in
a
the
bien des gens
midst
qui
and
disent
sort of
qui
after the civil
l'expliquent, qui
rights
expliquent ce
movement,
processus
where
qui
you
commence
see
après
the
le
sort of
mouvement des droits
creation of new
de
ethnic,
revendication des droits
white
civils
ethnic
où on voit la
minority groups.
création de
So all of a
nouveaux
sudden,
groupes
Irish Americans and Italian
de
Americans, groups of people whose
minorités
ancestors arrived in the
ethniques
late
blanches,
1800s,
des gens dont
you
les
know,
ancêtres sont arrivés à la
and
fin du
weren't
19e
necessarily
siècle
considered part of
et
the
qui
great
n'étaient
white
pas
family, had to work hard
vus
to be
comme des
understood as
membres de
white
la grande
because they
famille
were
blanche
poor
qui ont
and
dû
they were
travailler
seen
fort
as
pour être vus
not
comme
part
blancs
of the
parce qu'ils
sort of
étaient pauvres
Anglo-Saxon
et
majority.
n'étaient pas vus
All
comme
of a sudden,
membres
come
de
the
la grande
1970s and
majorité
80s,
anglo-saxonne.
their
Les années 70,
descendants, they
80,
don't want to be white anymore,
leurs
right? And
descendants
they
ne
want to
veulent plus
be
être blancs.
part of some sort of
Ils
ethnic
veulent
minority so that
faire
they can
partie
say,
d'une minorité
I'm
ethnique
not
et pouvoir
involved
dire
in the
que je
historic
n'ai
forms of
pas
racism,
participé
whether it's
au
slavery, whether it's
racisme
settler
historique, que ce
colonialism
soit
that took place.
l'esclavage, le
One of the complements or
colonialisme
corollaries of that is that
d'établissement ou quoi que ce
those
soit.
white
L'une des
Americans who are
corollaires est que
present,
ces
whose
Américains
ancestors go
blancs
back to the
dont les
Mayflower, the
ancêtres remontent
Pilgrims,
au
you know, who go
Mayflower,
back to the
les
1600s,
pèlerins
they start
dont
to discover that
l'ascendance
they
remonte
have quote
aux
unquote indigenous
années 1600,
princesses
ils découvrent
in
qu'ils
their
ont des
backgrounds.
princesses
And so you see one of the
autochtones
identities that
dans
becomes,
leur ascendance. Et
I
on voit
guess,
donc
over
comment
represented in census results, or that Americans are starting to really start at that point in
que
time
les
in the
Américains
80s,
commencent
sorry,
dans
the
les années
70s and
80,
80s to
les années
identify as
70
Cherokee, for
surtout à
instance.
revendiquer,
And
par
so there's
exemple,
a whole
l'identité
sort of body of
Cherokee.
literature that
Et donc, il y a
demonstrates those
toute une
two things are
littérature qui
happening at the
démontre
same time. And
que
that's
ces deux
also true to
choses
some
se
extent in
présentent en
Canada.
même temps. Et c'est
So
la
there's
même chose un peu au
pilgrimages that
Canada.
Scottish
Il y a des
Canadians, for instance, go
pèlerinages
to in the
où
Highlands to
les
sort of
Canadiens
relive their,
écossais
if you want, their Braveheart
retournent
days.
aux
And so
hautes
people
terres
in
de l'Écosse
Scotland are
pour
just like, what
revivre,
is going on?
pour
You know,
redécouvrir
that's
leur
not who we are
identité.
today.
Les Écossais
And we don't
disent, qu'est-ce
recognize
que
who
c'est que
you
ça?
think
Nous ne
your
sommes pas
ancestors are, because that's not the
comme
story we have about
ça
what it was
aujourd'hui.
like to be in the
Ce n'est
Highlands.
pas non plus.
But there's a way in which
Nous
that
n'avons
kind
pas,
of
nous ne
gets
racontons pas la même histoire que
romanticized.
vous sur
And
les hautes terres
so I
écossaises.
guess what I'm
Il y a
saying here
cette,
is that
on
these are
romance,
all
on va
identities
donc
are social and political to some extent. For some reason,
tisser une
as a
romance autour de
society, and this is
ces
part of the
identités,
settler
toutes ces
colonial
identités. Toutes les
project,
identités sont
we
politiques et
have
sociales dans une certaine
rendered
mesure.
indigenous
Ça fait
identity a
partie du
question of
projet
biology,
colonial.
a
On a
question
donc
of
on
really
a
of race.
essayé de
And indigenous
convertir
peoples have been telling us for
l'identité
hundreds
autochtone
of years
en une
that
question de biologie, une question de race.
they're nations,
Les
they're
autochtones nous
peoples,
disent depuis des
with
centaines
their
d'années qu'ils
own
sont
forms of
des
citizenship
peuples, des
orders and
nations
legal
avec leur
orders
propre forme de
that
citoyenneté, leurs
really
propres
are based in
ordres
kinship
juridiques
relations,
qui sont
right? Are
basés
based in sort of the obligations that come with making
qui
kin.
sont
And so,
enracinés dans les relations de parenté.
you know, my
Et
research
donc, moi, ma
alongside the
recherche,
research of Kim Tallbear and
avec la
Pam
recherche de
Palmater
Kim
and others who
Tallbear
have
et
really
Pam
written
Palmater
about
et d'autres qui ont
the
écrit
importance of
sur
respecting indigenous
l'importance
sovereignty and
du respect que
self-determination
l'on doit à la
demonstrate, I think,
souveraineté et
how this
l'autodétermination
movement
autochtone,
is fundamentally
démontre que
about
ce
expressing
mouvement
a racist logic, a logic that
finalement vise à
seeks to eliminate
exprimer
indigenous
une
people
logique
as
raciste,
peoples.
une logique qui cherche
Now,
à éliminer
when I say
les peuples
eliminate, that might
autochtones
seem
tels qu'ils
harsh and it might
existent.
sound like I'm saying a
Si
physical
j'utilise le mot
elimination, and that
élimine, vous
certainly has
pouvez
been part of
le
history.
trouver sévère.
But I am also saying
Pourtant,
here that it's
on l'a
about
vu dans l'histoire,
eliminating
mais je le
the
dis aussi
Crown, the federal
qu'aujourd'hui, on
government's
essaie
responsibility to
d'éliminer
Indigenous
la
peoples
responsabilité
that
de la
have been
couronne fédérale, c'est-à-dire
codified
le
in
gouvernement
different
fédéral,
treaties and agreements
envers les peuples
over the
autochtones,
past
tels que codifiés
centuries.
dans les différentes ententes et les
So
différents
I'm
traités
not
depuis des
I'm following the
siècles.
lead of my
Donc,
my
moi,
Indigenous colleagues,
j'emboîte le
and
pas
I do
à mes
not in
collègues
any way think that
autochtones et
DNA
je ne
ancestry
crois pas
tests
du
can
tout que les
demonstrate that
tests
one is
de
Indigenous.
descendance par
Thank you for that,
l'ADN
Darryl.
peuvent démontrer
I'm just
une
wondering if you
autochtonicité.
might be able to
Alors,
explain to us
merci
how
Darryl. Est-ce que tu peux nous expliquer
these newly discovered, founded Métis
comment
people and
ces
organizations, how are they
nouvelles
linked to
personnes qui revendiquent
anti-Indigenous
le
sentiment?
statut de Métis,
Sure.
comment
Yeah.
est-ce que ces
Thank
mouvements,
you,
ou
Springwater.
quel est
So
le
yeah,
lien
I mean, the
de ces
second part of my
mouvements
book,
à
I generally tend to focus
au
on the first part
sentiment
because people to kind of explain how
anti-autochtone?
this movement
Généralement, je
works.
parle de la
The
première
second part of the book
partie, mais la
is
deuxième
really
partie du
looking at two
livre
organizations that emerge
porte
essentially in the middle of the
sur deux
2000s, so
organisations
2005, 2006.
qui
One on the
ont
north shore of the St.
fait leur
Lawrence in
apparition
Innu
en 2006,
territory in Quebec, and
dont
one on the south shore of the St.
une
Lawrence in Gaspésie in Mi'kmaq territory.
qui
And both of
commence
those movements
sur
have
la rive nord, l'autre
some
sur la rive sud.
resemblance. And so you had mentioned this
Les
earlier,
mouvements se
Springwater. One of the
ressemblent,
sort
ces
of
deux
ways
mouvements.
in which I
Springwater,
think
tu
the
en avais
North Shore
parlé un
movement,
peu,
that's chapter 4 of my book, really
mouvement
sort
de
of
la rive nord,
illustrates
qui est écrit
how
dans le
this
quatrième chapitre de mon
drive to
livre,
become
illustre
Indigenous among French
cette
descendants is really
fébrilité de vouloir
oftentimes
devenir
based in
autochtone
sort of
parmi
a
les
political
personnes
desire to
d'ascendance
oppose
française.
actual First Nations people. Now, before I
Souvent,
continue,
cela
people hear
s'enracine
that
dans
and
ce
will often
désir
say,
de
well, it's not like
contester
everyone has those
les peuples
motivations, and I've never
autochtones. Mais ce n'est pas
suggested that.
tout le monde qui a ces motivations,
And individuals will have
diront
all
certains.
kinds of an array of different motivations, regardless of
Bien
people's
sûr, je ne l'ai
motivations.
jamais suggéré,
Claiming that
mais,
you're Indigenous when you're not is harmful to Indigenous
ça
peoples.
fait
But
mal
this
aux
movement in
peuples
particular,
autochtones quand on se
on the
dit
North Shore,
autochtone,
was a
quand on ne l'est
white
pas.
rights
Ce
movement.
mouvement
And
était un
so,
mouvement
as it
pour
happens across the country, when
revendiquer
there
les
are
droits blancs,
land
les
claim
droits des blancs.
negotiations,
Et
which
là
there
où il y a
was
donc
at
des
the time
négociations en
in Innu
matière
territory and
de
had been
réclamations
for a couple
territoriales,
decades,
comme il y
and they were
avait
kind of
eu, comme
coming
il y avait à
to,
cette époque,
I don't
depuis
want to say
déjà
a
quelques
close, but they
décennies,
were, moving
et que
along this
ces
process. There was an
négociations
agreement in
faisaient
principle
leur
that was
bonhomme
released.
de
It hasn't
chemin.
really
Il y avait
moved
déjà
since
eu une
then,
entente de principe
which
qui avait
often is the
été
case with
publiée.
land
Et
claims.
rien
And
n'a
so what
bougé
happened
depuis,
when the
en
agreement in
passant.
principle was
Bon,
released
qu'est-ce qui est arrivé à
was that there was
l'entente,
a huge
lors de
backlash in the
la
local
publication de cette
Québécois
entente de principe? C'est
population
qu'il y a
on the
eu
North Shore. So we're
une
talking
grande
about cette
réaction parmi les gens
Bécomo,
de cette île, de Bécomo et les
Lac-Saint-Jean,
autres,
Saguenay,
et
Chicoutimi,
de
those areas.
Lac-Saint-Jean, Chicoutimi, et tous
And
les personnes
as part of
d'ascendance
that
française dans
backlash, there was this
cette
sort of
région.
movement
Donc,
of
il y
white
avait un
Québécois
mouvement
people. They call themselves
de Québécois blancs qui
the
s'appelait,
what were they called? I'm trying to translate it in my head, but
j'essaie
essentially
de
they
le
were
traduire
the white rights group. And
C'était donc un
as
groupe
happens
qui
pretty much all
revendiquait
over
les
in
droits des
Canada, when
Blancs.
there are these types of
Et
claims,
comme partout au
white
Canada,
people
quand
will
de telles
often argue
réclamations
that their
se
rights are being
présentent, les
diminished
Blancs
in some way,
disent
that
que
land
leurs
is being
propres
taken away
droits
from
sont
them. That
brimés,
was never the
que
case with the
des
land
terres
claim. The
leur
First
sont
Nations, the
enlevées.
Innu
Ça
people
n'a
had
jamais
made that
été
clear for literally
le cas.
decades, had been
Les
reaching
Premières
out to
Nations le disent
communities
depuis des
all of
décennies,
this time, trying to
rejoignent
make it
des
clear what
collectivités
it was
depuis
that they were trying to get
longtemps
through
pour
these land
essayer
claims.
de leur
But in
expliquer
any case, this is what
ce
happened.
qui était
And
visé par ces
then there was a
réclamations
court
territoriales.
case,
C'est
a
ce qui est
Supreme
arrivé.
Court of
Ensuite, il y
Canada
avait
case that came down in 2003
un
that
arrêt
recognized
de 2003 de la Cour suprême
that
du
Métis
Canada qui a
people had
reconnu que les
Aboriginal rights under
Métis
Section
avaient des
35 of the
droits
Constitution.
autochtones en vertu
And
de
so that recognized a
l'article
particular community
35 de la
in Sault
Constitution.
Ste. Marie in
Donc,
Ontario,
cela a
specific to that
reconnu,
community,
a
but it set out
eu
a
pour effet de
test
reconnaître une
criteria
collectivité
and
à Sault
suggested that
Sainte-Marie, en
anyone
Ontario, et
anywhere
a
in
aussi
Canada
établi un
could
critère,
possibly pass that
de
test
sorte que
and meet
n'importe
that
qui au
criteria.
Canada pourrait
And so
répondre
the
à ce
people
critère,
who founded the
potentiellement.
white rights group and
Donc, les gens, les
were, I
fondateurs de
mean,
ce
among the most
groupe
vociferous,
pour
essentially white
revendiquer
supremacists.
les droits des
You know,
Blancs, c'était
the things
vraiment
that they were saying
des
about the Innu were
suprémacistes
absolutely
blancs,
horrible.
des choses qui
Almost
disaient
overnight,
des
as
personnes
this
autochtones
case was
étaient absolument
released, it started to
affreuses.
sort of,
Et donc,
filter
presque du
down
jour
into
au
the
lendemain,
community. They
ils ont
started to call themselves Métis.
commencé à
And
se
so they saw
revendiquer
it as an opportunity to
le
put a stop to
descripteur
the land
Métis.
claims.
Ils
And
voyaient
they were very
cela comme
clear
une
about that.
façon de
The
faire
federal
échec
government
aux
needs to, and the provincial government
réclamations
needs to negotiate
territoriales.
with
Et ils
us
disaient
because we're an
que le
Indigenous
gouvernement
people,
fédéral, le gouvernement provincial
just
doit
like the Innu, and
négocier
we have the
avec nous.
same rights. And
Parce
if
que nous
they're going
sommes
to
des
sign a
peuples
land claim
autochtones
with them,
aussi, nous avons les mêmes droits. S'ils vont
they are
signer
somehow,
une entente
they're
avec eux, ils doivent signer
contravening our
une autre
rights.
avec nous.
And so that was
S'ils
their
le font
argument.
sans le faire avec nous,
It's not
alors
that the
ils
argument
sont
was
en train de
particularly
contrevenir à nos
successful. It
droits.
did
L'argument n'était pas
throw a
très
wrench in the land
réussi,
claims, and the land
mais
claim has never
cela a
been
quand
resolved.
même
This
permis
organization
de retarder
sort of has splintered. There are three of them in the region now, with
le
about,
règlement des
last time I saw,
réclamations.
about 15,000 paying
s'est
members.
scindée
So
en
people pay a
trois groupes.
yearly
Maintenant, il y a
membership fee.
15
They were the
000
first
abonnés.
organization in
C'était
Quebec to go to court, provincial court, to be recognized as having Aboriginal rights under the Constitution as a Métis people, That case took many years to go through the courts, and eventually they lost. One thing to know is that I've been tracking court cases that are making these types of claims. So individuals or organizations are making these types of claims. There have been about 150 court cases in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, Quebec. There have been 2 in British Columbia. They involve an array of different types of claims. Mostly there are individuals, men who go out on the land and are stopped because they're hunting or fishing without a license, or they've overhunted or fished, and then they go to court to have their to see if the court will recognize them as having Aboriginal rights. Every single one of these cases, the individuals or organizations have lost. And so that's something that's really interesting about this movement, is it has not been very successful. First Nations in these territories, so from the Mi'kmaq out east to the Algonquin Anishinaabe, where I am in the sort of Ottawa River Valley, Ottawa River watershed, I should say, region, have spoken out forcefully against this movement as well. And the federal and provincial governments have not recognized groups that are part of, I guess you can say, this movement as legitimately Indigenous. So then why are we talking about it? Because our institutions have. So again, universities, school boards, hospital boards, federal bureaucracies, arts organizations, arts councils, the list goes on. So many institutions in our society have mistakenly, whatever one wants to say, innocently, regardless of what their intentions were, have recognized these individuals making these claims, these members of these organizations, as legitimately Indigenous, again, creating a great deal of harm to Indigenous people. And so that's just one example. I could talk about the other one in Mi'kmaq territory, but it's virtually the same thing. So my research, which was actually supported I went and visited a friend who's a new from one of these new First Nations in that region, just as I was sort of sitting down to start thinking about this book, and I was gifted, I think it was 15 DVDs full of data. And it was all of the material from these court cases. And so that's when I really was able to sit down and look at who these people were prior to turning into the quote-unquote chief of the regional Métis organization, or the, whatever it was that they were calling themselves, the knowledge keeper, as they will often sort of, or the elder, as they'll often call themselves. And so that, you can imagine, it's pretty difficult for everyday Canadians who don't have a lot of information or knowledge about Indigenous peoples to really sort out, like, what is it about these claims? I would suggest actually that it becomes easy to accept these claims because these people are us. Right? And if there's a familiarity with the individuals making the claims, that makes accepting them feel good.
I'm wondering if you could answer one more question before you continue. Mike, Emo is asking why there needs to be an intervention on the Eastern Métis.
Why? Yeah, so just to be clear, like the Eastern Métis, that's kind of a term that's generally given to this movement, so this Eastern Métis movement. I do want to be clear, though, that one thing that's happened in the past 5 or 6 years, as there's been more scrutiny of this movement, is that more and more people are turning to Algonquin claims or Mi'kmaq claims. And so they're kind of dropping the claim that they're Métis, and they're just saying straight out that they're Algonquin or Mi'kmaq, or in some cases Abenaki, as we see in the United States. They'll sometimes say that they're non-status, which is really a misunderstanding of what non-status means. You can't go back to the 1600s and have an ancestor and say that you're non-status today. The Indian Act only comes into being in 1876. That's when status exists, and people start losing it after that. So if you don't have an ancestor after 1876 who loses status, then you can't be non-status today. But there's a way in which people try to legitimize their claims and confuse people, right? Confuse well-meaning, well-intentioned people. And so in terms of the Eastern Métis movement, why it's important to intervene in it, I think I've sort of laid that out somewhat. But my sense is that First Nations people in particular, but also Métis people and Inuit people have fought very, very hard to at least have a seat at the table in some instances in institutions in our society. At the very least, right? It's not like representation is going to change everything in society, but representation is at least a start. Often those individuals in those positions are members of communities. They can bring the knowledge that they gain. They can bring the money they make in those positions. They can actually make a difference in their communities, right? And so what we have here are people who have no connection to Indigenous peoples, oftentimes promoting extremely harmful ideas about what it means to be Indigenous, and particularly First Nations or Métis. And they're given the position as a spokesperson for Indigenous people. They're there to represent, in many cases, First Nations children, First Nations families, survivors of residential schools, etc., etc. They're given those positions that Indigenous peoples have fought tooth and nail to get, right? And then all of a sudden, they're there as the spokesperson. And they will often, and the thing that it's hard to see happen, and I can only imagine how it feels if you're an Indigenous person. And I've spoken with many about how this often will manifest itself, but individuals will use sort of, I'll call it Indigenous trauma, but the intergenerational forms of trauma that exist among Indigenous peoples because of all of the racial violence that we've inflicted on Indigenous peoples. They'll use that trauma as if it's their own, right? And they'll claim that trauma as something that is in their body. And so it becomes extremely difficult when individuals who have no experience with that whatsoever, who are relying on ancestors in the 1600s for the most part, are using that trauma. It's almost, it's virtually impossible to put a stop to those individuals, right? Because then you have to actually find it within you to challenge their claims, and that can be quite difficult when it comes to particularly the intimate forms of violence that they'll often appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So should I continue? Okay, great. And so, like I said, this is the first time that I'm kind of trying to bring in these two different elements of my research. There's not going to be the French language sort of images in this part, and I'm sorry for that, but because it's really quite new. It's not something that's it's in my book. And so one thing that has emerged since I published my book in 2019 is, and this was somewhat clear to me prior to this, but is that genealogy obviously isn't the only part of the story. And so there are individuals who make these claims who have never even, thought about their family tree and or done genealogical research. They're doing it largely on the basis of a family story. A story that sort of pops up at some point in their past, or that they're told by someone in their family, that kind of propels them to make a particular claim. They never sort of bother to verify it, and so they're kind of just out there making these claims based on a story. And so what I've turned to recently, and it's meant to be complementary to the genealogical component. It's not like they're separate. They often work together. But there's a way in which what I'm calling family lore is an important part of this sort of movement, if you will. And so I've turned to literature written by sociologists, particularly feminist sociologists, who have been really studying family history and the intimacies of family history. And so this one sociologist, Carol Smart, she's British. She's been sort of looking at how secrets are kept in families, what types of secrets are kept, and what roles secret keeping plays in families. And so she demonstrates that the stories that people tell each other about their families, and I'm quoting here, cannot be regarded as simple factual accounts. Because in a way, the stories that we tell family members about our families are still mediated by the sort of relationships in the broader society, the personal, cultural, social relationships that exist that aren't just about our family. And so Smart through looking at this sort of particular set of data that goes back to the Second World War and sort of records family histories in Britain, has argued that family members deliberately deceive and fabricate events and chronologies in a manner that shields the family from public scrutiny or shame. And so you can imagine that as something that's fairly common. You know, family members, particularly because of those kinship bonds, don't want to necessarily expose their descendants and or their other family members to sort of conduct that might look bad on the family. And so instead of that, they might tell a story about who the family is or individuals were that in a way plays with the truth. So it's not so much lying, it might be a deception, it might be fabrication, but it's something that, you know, in a way helps the family move into being more, I guess you could say,
comment dire, cherche le mot.
To be seen as upstanding. And so there's another sociologist, an Australian one here, Ashley Barnwell, who's looked specifically, interviewed specifically family historians, especially those who do genealogical work, so genealogists in Australia, where you might know that there was sort of a lot of conviction for a long time. If you looked into the past, because there were a large proportion of the Australian settler population arrived in Australia as convicts, and there was a lot of shame among certain families. And so people would hide the identities and or the stories related to family members. And so she actually identified different forms of what you could call deviance, quote unquote, or behavior that led people to change stories about their family members. So criminality, sexual deviance, mental illness, family breakdown, homosexuality, and other social phenomena often carry profound stigma that led people in families to change the stories and or deceive family members about who their grandfather or their great-grandfather or their great-grandmother. So in her words, families create, adopt, and or perform particular practices in response to national pressures to censor and forget. So it's not just a matter of people making individual decisions in a family, but it's also how those decisions play into the larger sort of national scope. And so I just wanted to kind of give this just kind of primer on the theoretical material or the theoretical work that's done on secret keeping and family history and genealogy, just to give you a sense of where I'm going here when I say family lore. I'm not suggesting that people are lying or simply making up stories, but that these stories that circulate in families often hide certain elements of the past and or deceive descendants of certain individuals to sort of uphold a vision of who the family is and where they fit in society.
Parce qu'ils veulent pas nécessairement dire qui est la famille. Alors, les familles créent et adoptent et mettent en œuvre des pratiques particulières en réponse à ces pressions nationales et les expériences individuelles susceptibles de donner une mauvaise image de la famille. Donc, vous voyez ici le nom que vous avez peut-être entendu déjà, c'est Jeff Boyden, qui a évoqué, qui a dit être Métis, Mi'kmaq, Nipmuc et Anishinaabe déjà en 2016. Puis en 2021, c'était Carrie Bourassa qui a dit qu'elle était Métis, Anishinaabe et Diné, puis Margaret Moudin qui a dit qu'elle était Anishinaabe, et puis Elizabeth Hoover, il me semble qu'elle était à l'église, enseignant à l'Université de Californie, et qui a dit qu'elle était Mohawk ou Algonquin. Qu'est-ce qui se passe? C'est que lorsque des gens qui font ces revendications vont faire une déclaration, ils vont dire comment ils entendent leur identité. Alors, je ne vais pas vous parler de toutes ces personnes-là, mais je vais surtout mettre sur Joseph Boyden. L'héritage, a-t-il dit, de ma famille est ancré dans nos histoires et je les ai écoutées toute ma vie, qu'elles soient européennes ou autochtones. Lorsque j'étais enfant, mes sœurs
his books are being adopted by school boards across the country. He is about as famous of an Indigenous person as there was in Canada at the time. this story
Alors, il
drops, and
prétend
we discover that actually Joseph
d'être
Boyden's story
quelqu'un de
about the
très
Indigenous
important
is
et
factually
finalement son
incorrect,
histoire
and that his claim is not supported by any of the
n'est
documentary
pas réelle,
evidence. And this, of course, is
que
a story run by
et
APTN.
alors, cette histoire-là
And this is the story
qu'il
here. As you can see, it was
raconte
just before
a
Christmas
été véhiculée.
2016. That's Joseph
Alors, qu'est-ce que vous
Boyden, and it
savez
was written by
ici?
Jorge
C'est Boyden.
Barrera.
Il y
And
a
this is
une
the statement
déclaration
that Joseph Boyden released. He released it on
publiée
Cision,
par
which is sort of the
Herrera.
Canadian sort of website that's associated with
Et
a public relations firm that's headquartered in
Cision
Cayman
est
Islands.
un site
And so it was a well,
qui a publié
if you will,
son cas.
constructed response
Et donc,
that was
comme il l'a
likely
publié, c'est donc
mostly
qu'il a eu
done
un
by
récit
a public relations firm
épinglé,
in
bien
consultation
mis,
with Joseph Boyden.
etc.
But what I want to do is just kind of look
Et
at
ce que
a couple
j'aimerais
strands
vous
of the
dire, c'est
statement,
que
because
dans
this
cette
research I'm doing
histoire
now
bien
is looking
ficelée,
at these
il y
statements as a
a quand
particular type
même
of genre
des
as having
questions,
very specific themes, and those
des
themes get repeated
affirmations
over and over again.
qui n'étaient pas
And
de
so
la
this is part of the
réalité.
statement here I'd like for us to
Alors,
focus
voici
on. My
ce qu'il
family's
a
heritage is
dit.
rooted in our stories. I've
Alors,
listened to
il
them, both the
dit,
European and the Indigenous ones, all my
l'héritage de
life.
ma famille est
My
ancré
older
dans nos
sisters told
histoires.
me
Je les
since childhood about
écoutais
my white-looking
lorsque j'étais
father
enfant.
helping
Mes
his
sœurs
Indian-looking brother
aînées
hide their
m'ont
blood
raconté que
in
mon
order
père
to survive
d'apparence
in the early
blanche aidait
1900s.
mon frère
My mother's
d'apparence
family
autochtone à
history is
cacher
certainly
leur
not
sang
laid
pour
out neatly in the
poursuivre
official
leur
records
début
or on
récent. L'histoire de la
Ancestry.ca
famille de
either.
ma mère
From the
n'est
age of 9 or
certainement
10,
pas
the woman I knew as
présentée
my
de manière
grandmother told
claire
me stories
dans
about
les
my mother
documents
that,
officiels.
until
Dès l'âge
recently,
de
my
9
mother
ans,
preferred
celle
not
que
to share
j'appelais
with anyone.
grand-mère
The
m'a
details are
raconté
private and
des
painful,
histoires
yet my
sur
mother
ma
has been
mère que
forced to
j'ai
revisit
jusqu'à
aspects of her
maintenant
past she
appelée
believed
ma
were
mère,
closed away
que
forever.
ma mère
And
préférait
so,
garder
in
pour
the
elle,
sort of remaining
malgré
part
le
of my
fait que
presentation,
les
I'll
événements
focus
sont
on the
intimes et
father's
douloureux.
side. You can see here
Ma
that Boyden
mère
is making a claim
a
that both
dû
his father,
revisiter des aspects de son
so
passé qu'elle
paternal
croyait à
and
jamais
maternal sides, are indigenous in
enterré.
some
Donc,
way, right?
on va pas
I'll
aller
focus
plus
on his
loin, mais on
father's,
va aller à son
but this
oncle,
chapter that I
un
co-wrote with
oncle
a colleague looks at
qu'il
both of those
avait
sort of
nommé
claims
oncle Earl.
that were very clearly debunked in the APTN story.
Alors, tout ça a été
And
publié,
so what
donc
Boyden doesn't tell
qu'est-ce
us
qu'on
in
voit?
that particular part of the statement is that his uncle Earl, who you remember is the
C'est
quote-unquote
que c'est
Indian-looking
monsieur
one, so
Uncle
his
Earl
father's
a été
brother,
nommé
he
Indian
actually,
Joe,
these are photos of Uncle Earl. You can see him
qui
here.
vendait des
You can see him
souvenirs
here. This
indiens
is him in
authentiques.
Manhattan, if I'm not
Earl
mistaken.
Boyden
You can see him here wearing a
se
headdress,
disait
here
avoir
again
l'esprit
at a
indien.
gala. And so this is a
Enfin,
McLean
qu'est-ce
story.
qui est arrivé, c'est
McLean's
qu'on voit
magazine, I'm sure
l'histoire
many
d'un
of you
McLean
know.
qui racontait, c'est que
This is a
quand
story
il
you can see
était
at the bottom
jeune,
here from
enivré par les tintams, les cris
1956.
de guerre et les bonnets de
And it's an
guerre suspendus, le
investigation
petit
into Earl.
Earl tombe immédiatement
It
amoureux
turns out
sous le
that
chant des
Boyden's
Indiens.
uncle,
Il s'est mis à
Earl
découper
Boyden,
des images
and they're
d'Indiens, à
from
improviser
an
les
upper
costumes
class Ottawa
d'Indiens,
family.
à collectionner
He
des
sort of took
souvenirs
on the
indiens.
persona
Sa
of an
chambre
Indigenous
était
person
dans une vieille
in
maison
early
de Boyden
1950s. He called
dans l'avenue
himself
Mackenzie, à
Injun
l'ombre
Joe,
des bâtiments du
as you can
Parlement, est
see here.
devenue une collection
And
d'arcs
so
et de
this story
flèches et de
sort of
peaux de daims.
outlines who Earl Boyden was
Alors,
and
tout
the types
ça,
of sort of
il nous
things that he
parle
did
de
as Injun Joe. In
de ce
particular, he
qu'il a
set up a
fait
trading
en
post
tant qu'Indian Joe.
at
Tout
one of the
d'abord, il
busiest
a eu une
intersections entering
boutique
Algonquin
dans
Park,
une
probably one of the
des
busiest
avenues les
tourist
plus
sites
importantes
in sort of southern
de sa
Ontario. So it's a very
ville, dans le
busy
sud de
site where
l'Ontario.
Europeans at this time in particular, but still
Alors,
today,
à ce
Europeans,
moment-là, il y avait
Americans,
beaucoup de
and people from the
touristes
GTA, the Greater Toronto
européens,
area, will
américains,
flee to get out of the city. And so he sets up
qui
a trading
venaient.
post
Alors,
and
donc,
makes what
il
he
se
calls
met à
sort of,
vendre
I'm going to use a
des
different word than Indigenous
souvenirs
sort of arts and crafts and sells them to tourists
de
as
l'artisanat,
Injun Joe.
disons autochtone, entre
And so
guillemets,
this is a
aux
postcard
touristes.
of
Alors, nous avons
Uncle
ici
Earl's business.
une
You can see here that
carte
he has a
postale
couple
de
teepees
ce
set up. This one
Uncle
here looks like
Earl.
it's falling over. It's really, really badly
On voit
put
que
together. The original
on
Injun
a
Joe, the
mis
sign says. You can see it
une
says
affiche
Ugh.
qui est en train de
And
tomber,
the
mais on voit
expression
le
one
Indian
assumes that
Joe
this person is
avec
making
son allure
genuine Indian
d'Indien,
souvenirs. There's
genuine,
a white
habillé
family
en peau de
who are
dame
visiting his
et
trading
un
post.
tipi.
Sort
Alors
of,
voilà, et
this
c'est là
child seems
qu'il
to
a
be
son
adopting
commerce.
some sort of stereotypical
Alors, vous voyez ici un enfant
Indigenous
qui adopte
sitting pattern.
une
And
posture
so these are postcards that are still
assis,
available for
style indien.
purchase online in different
Alors tout
places. It was a
ça,
very, very
même on
popular
commence à vendre tous
tourist site.
ces cartes postales en
And
ligne.
I'm just going to continue with the story a little
Alors, je vais continuer avec l'histoire.
It grows up in Ottawa. He was born at the very end of the 1800s. And this is what
raconté l'histoire. On a ici l'histoire dont je viens de
Joseph
parler.
Boyden's quote-unquote Indian-looking uncle. Excited by tom-toms and war cries and trailing war bonnets, little Earl fell in love with Indians on the spot. He took to cutting out pictures of Indians, improvising Indian costumes, collecting Indian souvenirs. His bedroom in the old Boyden home on Mackenzie Avenue in the shadow of the Parliament building contained a litter of bows and arrows and buckskin. His most treasured possession was a 5-foot coffee teepee his Aunt Bertha O'Donovan sent him from New York. The Last of the Mohicans was his favorite book, and he and his two brothers saved their nickels to see Bronco Billy Anderson on Saturday afternoon at the neighborhood movie house. And Custer's Last Stand, a stage show that came to Ottawa's Grand Ole Opera House
pour aller
in
voir Bronco
1907.
Billy Anderson le
School
samedi
bored young
après-midi
Earl. His
au
thoughts were
cinéma
elsewhere.
du
He saw
quartier
himself as a
et
white boy who,
Custer's
by his
Last
knowledge of
Stand, un
hunting and outdoor
spectacle de
lore, is
théâtre
adopted by
présenté
Union
au
Chief
Grand Opera
and
House
given a
d'Ottawa
place
en
of honor in
1907.
the tribe.
L'école en nuit, le jeune
And so this was obviously
et sa pensée
following
est ailleurs.
interviews with Earl. And you can see how
Il se voyait comme un
growing up,
garçon blanc grâce à ses
so
connaissances en matière de chasse, d'activités
I'll get back to that in a
traditionnelles,
second. So this is
au
a photo of Earl
grand-père.
outside of one of the teepees he constructed in full regalia. He's got some sort of
Il a
an axe in
adopté
his
donc
hand.
cette allure de chef indien et
And
reçoit une place
can
d'honneur
imagine
de la
that
tribu.
people in Boyden's family would consider him quote unquote Indian looking because he appears to perform a particular identity, right? He appears to be Indigenous from the way that he dresses, at least stereotypically, and the fact that he has this particular trading post. And so calling him Indian looking isn't exactly wrong, it's not exactly a lie, but anyone could appear that way if they perform that identity appropriately.
Donc, revendiquer cette identité.
And so one of the really
pour les gens
unfortunate things that happens to Joseph Boyden's uncle is that he kills a tourist. And so there are some American tourists who are visiting his trading post, and they want to take a photo. They actually have a camera, I should say, like a video camera. They want to take a sort of shoot a bit of a film clip of this unbelievable quote-unquote Indian who's in full regalia. And so Boyden goes and gets his
qui était en attirail indien, et donc il est
Anyways,
allé chercher
it's a rifle. So he gets his rifle out of his teepee where he runs his business, and not knowing that it's loaded, he actually accidentally shoots one of the tourists.
Il a tué l'un des touristes par accident. Parce qu'il ne savait pas
and so that's quite a tragic event, right? Not only does he kill someone, but it ends up becoming a high-profile
très tragique, et c'était devenu donc
and so he goes to court. He's
une affaire
eventually he's found not guilty.
Il a
So
été
he doesn't
non
spend any time in
coupable,
prison, but
il n'a
shortly
pas
after,
dû faire
we can see here that
la prison,
Uncle
mais
Earl commits
on
suicide.
voit que plus tard,
And so
il s'est
you can
suicidé.
see how this happens before Joseph Boyden is born. So he never actually meets his uncle.
De Joseph Boyden. Il n'a jamais rencontré
not in person. But if we were to take the work on family secret keeping and family history and how that sort of operates, you can imagine that as a young child, Joseph would have been probably protected by family members from knowing the truth, right? About what happened to his uncle, how his life came to an end, how he had essentially killed another human being. Instead of telling that story, one would tell the fantastical story about how he attracted so many tourists and how stories were written about him in the national magazine. And so that sort of type of story becomes this family lore that propels young Joseph and other members of his family to imagine themselves as Indigenous. One thing that becomes clear later on in this chapter that we wrote that I'm not going to get into quite as much today is that there's an interview with his mother, so this would be the other side of his family.
Il y a eu une entrevue avec sa famille,
his
avec
uncle,
sa mère, l'autre côté de sa famille.
And they both talk about how it's Joseph himself who starts to claim to be Indigenous. Not anyone else in the family. No one else further back, right? And so Joseph interprets the fact that his uncle had this identity, and now the story becomes not just that he sell trinkets to tourists, but that he had lots and lots of Indigenous friends. and that Indigenous
Joseph commençait
people
à
worked for
imaginer
him and produced
ces heures,
material
en
for
fait,
him, although
qui
that is
commençaient à
still
le revendiquer.
questionable,
Et
given
Joseph
what is in the
imaginait donc
story
qu'il
and how
avait
it
beaucoup
appeared that he
d'amis
made a lot of the
autochtones.
trinkets himself. And so
Apparemment, il fabriquait une bonne
one can
partie
imagine that sort of
objets qu'il vendait lui-même.
repurposing
Mais bon, on
that
pourrait donc
life to give it some
imaginer
meaning
que
becomes important for
Joseph
people today.
euh,
Becomes a way to
trouve important
reclaim
de
a particular
donner une
proud
signification particulière à
history
cette vie
of
la vie
having
de
a
son oncle.
relationship with
Ça devient donc une
Indigenous peoples.
histoire fière de
And
relation
so
avec les
I just
peuples
want to kind of
autochtones
leave us on
dans
that.
l'esprit de
Now, this
Joseph
is
Boyden.
work that I'm kind of,
Je laisse
stitching
cela
together,
là. C'est une recherche que je
trying
commence
to think
à
through. So I'm more
faire.
than happy to
J'essaie
take
donc
some
de
feedback on it.
réfléchir à
But
ces
what I'm trying to
différents
get
aspects.
at here
Je
is
n'ai
that
pas
the
encore
stories that
arrêté
we
mon opinion
hear
là-dessus, mais
in our families, whether they're coming
mais ce que
from
j'essaie de vous
our
dire, c'est qu'on
grandparents
entend
or
ces
they're coming from
histoires
an aunt
de
or
nos
an uncle or whatever the
grands-parents,
case
de
may
nos
be,
oncles,
or
nos
whether they're
tantes.
coming from, in this case, someone like Joseph Boyden who's telling them
On
to
entend
his
ces
mother
histoires
and uncle, look,
de
I
la
found that
bouche de
we're actually
quelqu'un comme
Indigenous.
Joseph Boyden, qui raconte des histoires
These
racontées
stories
par
are not
ses
simply
proches,
truthful.
mais
They
qui
need to be unpacked.
sont
Living in
fictives.
a particular settler colonial
L'histoire
context
doit
where the
avoir un impact.
elimination of
Ce n'est pas
Indigenous
que de la
peoples
vérité
is
ou
sort
pas.
of
Ce n'est pas qu'une
oftentimes
question
what
de vérité.
propels
Dans
our
un
stories
contexte
about who we are
comme
forward. We need
celui-ci,
to understand
qui
and try
motive
as
et
best as we
qui
can
fait
to
bouger notre
verify
histoire. Il
the
faut
types of
bien
stories that
comprendre et
circulate
essayer
in
de
our families
vérifier
and
les
not
types
take them as
d'histoires
truths.
qui
And so many
circulent
of the
dans nos
people,
familles, de ne pas
many
les
of the people
accepter
I
comme de
mentioned
la
earlier and
pure vérité.
showed
Bien
in
des
that
gens
sort of timeline, they're
que
simply
j'ai
reiterating
mentionnés
stories that they may have heard at one point in their
dans les
family and
forums
or
ne
creating those
font que
stories themselves
réitérer
to
les
match what
histoires
they
qu'ils
have
ont
heard
entendues dans leur
circulating in
famille
a
ou
family.
créent leurs
And
propres histoires
they
afin
never
de
bother to
répondre
verify it. And I think
à
we
ce
need to
qu'ils ont
move beyond
déjà entendu dans leur famille et
self-identification
n'essaient jamais de les vérifier. Il
and
faut
sort of
passer au-delà
just sort of
de
simply believing these
la
stories to one where we're respecting
l'auto-identification
Indigenous sovereignty and
à
self-determination
une
in the ways that
situation ou
Indigenous
à
people
un
have been called to.
contexte où on respecte la souveraineté et
And
l'identité
so,
autochtone.
voici quelques articles que j'ai écrits en français. Si vous voulez en lire en français, je vais laisser ça avec les organisateurs, organisatrices. Ça, c'est la traduction de mon livre en français, Ascendance détournée quand les Blancs revendiquent une identité autochtone, qui a été publié en 2022, à Prise de parole à Sudbury. And I've already sort of talked a bit about my book here. Oops, and there's some other articles that I've written.
Et voilà donc d'autres articles que j'ai
movement
écrits
and the basis of this movement. One of them
ce
particularly
mouvement et la
looks
base de
at
ce
sort of the
mouvement,
literature that has
dont
emerged
un
supporting
article
this
qui
movement.
porte
So we'll
sur
call it
la
Eastern Métis
bibliographie
Studies.
qui
I call it that
soutient
in this chapter.
ce mouvement. Donc,
And so there's a few
appelons-le
other things that I've
les
published
études
that
des
you're more than
Métis
happy
de
to
l'Est.
contact me
Entre
for if
guillemets,
you
vous
aren't able to get a
pouvez
copy.
me contacter à ce sujet si
The
vous ne pouvez
organizers
pas
will
obtenir une
have this
copie de ce
share.
livre ou de
And
ces
so here's
articles.
my contact information.
Et
Feel free to be in
voilà
touch
donc mes coordonnées.
if you have
Je
any questions.
vais faire
Thank you.
de mon mieux pour vous fournir le nécessaire. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Darryl.
Merci, Darryl.
I'm just wondering, do you have we have time for a question or two?
Il nous
Sure.
reste quelques minutes pour
I'm just going to stop
questions.
sharing my screen.
For sure. We have a question here from Songran Kim, who's wondering about whether or not First Nations have any identity authentication systems.
Des systèmes d'authentification.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
The question is like, do First Nations groups have a way to like basically validate somebody's Indigenous ancestry or identity? Sorry.
Well, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, Springwater, but it may be something that you might feel comfortable also kind of addressing. My understanding is that most of that will revolve around an understanding of kinship, right? And so who are you related to tends to be one of the major ways that particularly First Nations people, but also Inuit people will sort of introduce themselves to others, right? And so that's one way of having a conversation about how you belong. You know, introducing that idea of, do I know your grandmother? You know, do I know your aunties? And so when we talk about kinship relations and particularly kinship obligations as sort of central to Indigenous identities, I think that's really what we're getting at, right? And so just to kind of come back to the question, I think it was asking for something maybe
Pour revenir à la
a
question,
little bit different, but I think that's how it kind of gets expressed in a colloquial term, a colloquial ways. Now, of course, there are people who have been disconnected because of the 60s scoop, because of all of these policies and laws that Canadian society has sort of put in place that really have been about breaking up Indigenous families. And so I want to be clear that my research is much more is only really about people who are making long ago claims. And those people who are trying to reconnect through reasserting their kinship relations and obligations, they do so in all kinds of different ways. What I've seen, just in terms of the conversations I've had with First Nations people in particular, is that there's a general openness to accepting those people in the community and wanting to find those individuals, wanting to know where they were, where they ended up, because they're still members of the community and they were taken away at some point, and people still remember them and still want them to come home. And so, when it comes to sort of formal mechanisms, there are different approaches. Across across what we call Canada today. The Mi'kmaq, for instance, in Nova Scotia, they put in place something. They're in sort of in negotiations. They have been for quite a long time when it comes to sort of putting into practice, I guess you can say, the treaties they signed in the 1700s. And so they've come up with their own sort of citizenship model, and that revolves around being able to connect ancestrally or genealogically with a Mi'kmaq family who they've identified. There are many of them. Going back to like the mid-1800s, the 1860s. And so they're saying, they're recognizing that people have been and were disconnected through the Indian Act, for instance. And they are accepting those people for the most part as Mi'kmaq. Right? And so if you're going back to the 1600s, that's a different story. Right? Those people tend to be Acadians today. If they do have ancestry and only ancestry in the 1600s. And so the Mi'kmaq have decided not put status as central to how they're defining who their people are. And that's really what you see First Nations doing across the country, is taking sort of control of their sort of citizenship, if you will, away from the federal government. So it's not just status that comes to define who's First Nation, but it's other sort of kinship factors.
Thank you. One of the things that I know, like when we think about a lot of the race shifters, they've gained a lot of traction, in terms of being able to access grants and bursaries that are specifically for, Indigenous folks, and some of them are even gaining employment opportunities on the claim to their quote unquote Métis identity. In terms of I put this in quotations, to the Eastern Métis, is anyone taking them seriously other than themselves?
Est-ce qu'il y a des gens qui prennent ces gens au sérieux à part eux-mêmes?
Yeah.
Les Métis de l'Est.
It would appear not, except again, it's really about the way in which these individuals have been able to infiltrate public institutions.
Ont quand même réussi à infiltrer des institutions publiques.
I mean, if it wasn't for that, then you can imagine, like, there would be some concern about that possibility and all that, but there's a very large proportion of individuals claiming they're Indigenous in public institutions who simply aren't. And I don't have a figure on how many would depend on which type of public institution. But we're talking about likely thousands across the country. And so that in and of itself is quite harmful to Indigenous people. Just the fact that you have essentially white people taking up these positions. Now imagine if thousands of Indigenous people had those positions. What kind of impact that would have on the everyday life of those individuals and their families and their communities, just on that level. Besides the fact that these positions are often positions where those individuals represent Indigenous people. Right? It's not just about having a job, but it's
Ces
about
gens
actually being the
représentent
voice
les
of
peuples
Indigenous
autochtones.
people
Ce
at
n'est pas
the
qu'un
table.
poste. Ils sont,
And so those
par le fait
individuals
de
will
détenir ces
often
postes, la voix des peuples
promote ideas of
autochtones.
what it means
Ces
to be
gens vont
Indigenous
souvent
that are
promouvoir
extremely
des
problematic.
idées d'autochtonéité
And
qui
even
sont
if they're
très
not problematic,
problématiques. Et
they're not
même quand
Indigenous, right?
elles
Even
ne
if
le
they're
sont pas,
literally
ce ne
copy
sont
and
pas
pasting
des
what they read
idées
in a book
des
written by an
autochtones, même si
Indigenous
c'est des gens
person,
qui
it's
font
not for
du
them to do that. It's for them to
copier-coller
give up that
de ce
position
qu'ils ont
and
lu dans
sort of
un livre écrit par un
step
autochtone.
aside.
Ils n'ont pas, ce n'est pas à eux de le faire.
Steve was wondering if you
Steve
could
se
speak
demande
to Métis citizenship as a mode of
si tu peux
validating
parler
Métis
de
claims.
la
Yeah, so I
citoyenneté
mean, the
métisse
Métis
comme
Nation itself does
une
have
façon de
its
valider
own
les
sort of like
revendications.
citizenship protocols,
La
and
nation
so
métisse a ses propres protocoles de
essentially what one needs to
citoyenneté.
do is
Donc,
to demonstrate
essentiellement,
a
ce qu'il faut
connection
faire,
to
c'est de
someone
démontrer
who
un lien
was Métis in
de
the past.
parenté
And by
vers
Métis, they
quelqu'un
don't
qui était
mean mixed
métis dans le
race.
passé.
That's a common misconception in Canadian society. What makes the Métis an Indigenous people isn't that they're mixed with First Nations. It's that they had a particular sort of political and social and sort of economic role and relationships with First Nations people on the sort of plains and the prairies. And so we can go back to, I think it was about the early 1820s, if I'm not mistaken, there was a sort of a diplomatic alliance that was signed between the Assiniboine, the Plains Cree, the Saulteaux, who are the sort of Anishinaabe west of the Great Lakes, and the Métis. And that political alliance was called the Iron Alliance. And that was the recognition by the Métis First Nation kin that they were Indigenous, that they were Indigenous collectivity, not unlike the Plains Cree and the Assiniboine and the Saulteaux. Many Indigenous people, First Nations, are mixed on some level.
Parce que
right?
de toute
On
façon,
some level,
on
there's,
sait que
not always
plusieurs
by choice,
membres
right? We're talking
des
about the sort of
nations
impacts of
ont des sangs
colonialism.
mélangés
And so it's not the
entre
mixedness of
ces
the
nations-là.
Métis that
Donc,
makes
ce n'est
them
pas
unique.
le fait,
It's the relationships that they have continued to
ce n'est pas
maintain
le
as
sang
Indigenous peoples with their First
qui
Nation
les
kin.
rend ce qu'ils
And
sont,
when you
mais
go
le
out
fait
west, the first few
qu'ils sont
times
de
that I went out there,
relations
I was
et ce qu'ils font
surprised,
et comment ils vivent.
at what
Et moi, quand je suis allée
at the
dans
Métis
l'Ouest, j'étais
people I
même
encountered
très surpris
and the sort of conversations
de
that we
voir
had about what
et
it
les
meant to be Métis.
conversations que j'avais
Being from out here,
à
I had read
propos de
about it,
Métis
I'd spoken with some friends
et
about
que
it, some
j'avais
colleagues.
au
But
sujet
then when I
desquels
go and
j'avais
present my
lu.
work out there, it's a completely different
Et
situation
alors,
where being
c'était très
Métis
bien
is not at
pour mon
all,
travail,
doesn't
mais lorsque
resemble
je
what it
suis
means to be quote
allée
unquote Eastern Métis here.
dans leur
You can
communauté,
see that
c'était
many
une
Métis
réalité tout
communities
à
out
fait
west
nôtre
have really maintained their relationship with First Nations
parce que
and
beaucoup
really
de Métis
valued those
ont
relations.
vraiment,
And so those kinship
des Métis
relations
sont
have been
gardés
maintained
le
in a lot of
rapport
cases, not in
avec
all cases, but for in many
les
cases,
Premières Nations.
for well
Et,
over 100 years. And
et,
so,
et
yes, the
ça date
Métis
quand même
Nation, through their different
depuis
affiliates,
1800.
do have their own citizenship protocols, and I respect those protocols.
Et
I'm not
il
in
y a
any way
vraiment des
challenging them,
protocoles de
and that's why
citoyenneté
I often
métis.
work with Métis governments,
C'est
because
pourquoi je
my
travaille
research
souvent avec des
is
gouvernements
about
métis,
completely different groups.
parce que ma recherche se centre sur d'autres groupes, pas le leur.
I'm wondering in terms of
Merci. Je me demande,
do you have any thoughts or ideas on how white folks in particular and
votre opinion
institutions like the United Church of Canada can disrupt the problem of race shifting?
Comment est-ce que les membres blancs de l'Église du Canada peuvent
comes up a lot when I'm presenting this work and in conversations with different
ce
folks
genre
that
de
I work with,
changement
particularly Indigenous
d'identité,
folks, is that question,
ce
right?
sujet.
So how do we
Alors,
come up with a strategy? And so what you see a lot of First Nations
on
doing in
essaie de voir
particular is
quelles
coming up
sont
with
les
those sort of
stratégies.
citizenship protocols, right? And so
Par
that's
exemple, il y
one
a
way
des
to be like, well,
protocoles.
we do know that there are people out there who might be non-status and are trying to reconnect, and how
Par
can we sort
exemple,
of
il y a
facilitate
tellement
that,
de
and how can we
personnes qui
claim the
peuvent
First Nations
revendiquer
in a
le
way where those
statut.
people aren't going to start claiming a
Des
completely different
autochtones qui n'ont pas
identity
de,
and then really harm,
statut. Il y en a
First
d'autres
Nations
qui n'auraient pas le droit, mais qui
rights
le
and
revendiquent. Alors,
etc.
il y a
So usually when it comes to institutions, what my experience is that a lot of
des
institutions right
façons
now are
de le
trying to
faire
deal with
à
this,
niveau
trying to come up with ways to sort
institutionnel,
of address
c'est
these
de faire
concerns. And that starts
une
with a
recherche,
lot of
et c'est
institutions with
pourquoi j'en
having these types
parle
of
dans
conversations and
mes
really
livres.
listening to
Je parle
the
des
sort of First
institutions
Nations
qui
and Inuit or
existent.
Métis people who are connected to particular sort of communities and are recognized as
Par
such by their
exemple, je
communities
parle de
on
certains
what
membres de
needs
la
to be done.
communauté Métis
And so,
qui a des
I
rapports
don't know
avec les
exactly how
Premières
things work with the
Nations.
United Church
Je
or
ne
what
sais
types
pas
of
comment ça se
sort of
passe à
situations
l'intérieur
you
de
may find yourself
l'Église
in,
unie
but
du
it could be with
Canada. Je
partnerships or
connais pas votre
etc.
situation.
I would, suggest that you have a
Mais
strong body of Indigenous people who are sort of
moi,
empowered
je
to make
pense que la
decisions
meilleure
about
des
who you
choses,
enter
c'est
into
que
partnerships with, and
si vous savez un
who
bon
you
nombre de
hire
personnes
for Indigenous
autochtones,
positions, and how you develop
que
Indigenous initiatives with
vous
actual Indigenous
s'adressiez à
peoples,
eux
and
pour
etc.
savoir
And
comment eux, ils voient
and as much
les
as this might
situations.
seem
Et même si
obvious,
cela
I
paraît
just found out that
évident qu'ils peuvent
the
vous aider,
Ontario
ben, je
Ministry of
pense que
Education just hired a fake
il
Métis
y a
person
aussi
as their lead on French language Indigenous initiatives in
il
the
y a
province
des
for
situations, par
all school
exemple,
boards,
comme une
Catholic
institution
and
en
public in
Ontario
the French
qui
language.
a
And
engagé un
she,
Métis
what does she do in these
comme
positions? She
représentant
invites
de
other
la
people
langue
like her
française,
to
comme
speak
si
for
elle
Indigenous
était
peoples, right? And so,
membre
as much as there's
de
progress
la
made in
communauté métisse,
some
alors qu'elle ne
cases,
l'était
if
pas.
you don't have
Alors,
something in place to prepare for
alors,
these
si
types
vous
of
n'avez pas
situations, what's going to
structuré
happen is you
quelque
end up sitting
chose devant ces
across the
situations,
table from someone who is going to tell you a story
c'est
that is going to be
que
very compelling about
vous
what makes
allez
them Indigenous.
vous
Right? If
retrouver
nothing else, what I
à
found
tabler
out is
avec
that
une personne
people who are
de
making
l'autre
these claims,
côté
white
qui va
people who
vous
are
dire,
making
moi
these
je suis
claims, are
métis ou je suis autochtone,
well
et
versed.
qui ne l'est
They
pas.
understand
Alors,
anti-colonial, decolonial politics. They understand the politics of reconciliation,
il y a
and
les
they're able
Blancs
to
qui
forward
comprennent
arguments that
la
will,
réconciliation,
often
les
bring
questions
people who, again, are maybe very well-meaning on
de
board with
racialisation,
their fraud.
mais il faut aller
And so you
voir
need
à la
people who
source,
are able
voir
to
les
sift through
recherches.
this.
Il
And
faut
if
que
it's
vous
not,
ayez
obviously you need
des
people,
gens
and then you
qui
also need, some
puissent
sort of approach that you can
regarder
apply in very different situations.
s'ils le sont et développer peut-être une
Well, thank you
approche
so much,
pour
Darryl.
se faire, pour
Thank
voir
you.
qui il est et
It's
qui
been a
n'est
real
pas.
pleasure. I
Alors,
was
merci
super
beaucoup,
excited
Darryl. C'était un
about you
plaisir.
coming tonight.
J'étais
Thank
vraiment
you.
très, très
Yes.
heureuse à l'idée
And
de
yeah,
vous
just
rencontrer
thank you
ce
so
soir.
much. And I really,
Et
really encourage
merci
everyone
beaucoup.
to
Et
read,
je demande
purchase Darryl's
vraiment,
book,
j'invite
and
à tout le monde à lire le livre de
educate
Darryl.
yourself around this issue. Yeah, and I know that
Informez-vous
Adele
à
needs a
propos
few
de ces
minutes with
sujets.
the participants. So once again,
Je
thank you
sais
so much.
que maintenant, on va avoir un petit
Thank you
moment
so
avec
much,
les
Springwater.
participants
It's been
et on
good to get to know you.
remercie Darryl
Wonderful.
de
Thank
sa
you,
présence ce
Springwater.
soir.
Thank you, Darryl. Thank you so much for
Merci
this time of
Springwater,
engagement.
Darryl.
We are wrapping up
D'être venu.
this
Maintenant,
time,
nous
and so just
allons
noting that in
procéder
the
à la
chat,
clôture de notre
there's the
réunion.
link in case you want
Je
to explore
vois
more about the
qu'il
40
y a dans
days
le
of
chat
engagement on anti-racism. The
un
written
lien
reflections, this
qui vous
recording will be
informe
posted online as well.
davantage sur les 40 jours
Next
de
week,
lutte
if
contre
you would
le
like to join us
racisme,
online, we'll be
d'activités,
exploring anti-racist and decolonial theologies.
ça vous
That will
dire
be in English
comment
only.
est-ce qu'on développe
Anyone is welcome to attend.
du
And the
matériel.
very
Il
last,
y
we
a
will
beaucoup
keep
de choses
gathering on
qui se passent
Tuesday
en anglais,
evenings,
mais
and the
on
very
vous
last session on
invite à
November
aller
28th
quand
will
même
be
chercher. Il
bilingual
y a
one.
une
Again, that
réunion le
last one will
28
focus on
novembre
the
qui est
lettucing. So
encore
we're thankful that you were here this evening.
un
And again, as you
événement
leave,
où il y
there'll be a
aura
short exit survey.
traduction
If you're able to respond to
anglais-français
those questions, that would be very
et
helpful for us
vice-versa.
all.
Alors,
And thank you once
merci
again to
Darryl
Darryl and
d'avoir
Springwater.
répondu
Thank you to
à
everyone for being here,
Darryl d'avoir
and
répondu aux
blessings on your day.
questions. Et merci à Springwater et on bénit votre journée.